Cool Figure TV. Revolutionary salute. Revolutionary salute. Like, share, subscribe. Welcome to the House of Revolution. You know I'm your humble host, the Yao Mean of Revolution, and I got a World War III alert. for y'all. But before we get into that, y'all be sure to wipe y'all feet. That means hit the like button. Like, share, subscribe, support the platform, y'all. Well, until Trump humble himself and apologize to Yemen, I don't know when the humiliation is going to stop for him. And when will the U.S. warships quit getting attacked because he opened his mouth and threatened those people?
According to Hindustan Times and some other media outlets, United States military, quote, gets desperate after Houthis' fifth missile attack. These attacks have become relentless in the last 1 week. And United States military...
That one of our aircraft carriers have been relocated and they bringing in another aircraft carrier. You know why they probably doing that? It's because the SS Harry Truman probably was damaged by the Yemeni freedom fighters, and they don't want to say that it was damaged. They don't want to say they running out of that high power. The Yemen won't stop shooting at them. Trump, I thought you was finna put an end to Yemen. You see, he been real quiet last 2 days because he finally starting to find out. You'll get your Vietnam playing with these people. You're not finna win nothing. And we warned it here first right here at Cold Figure TV News Network. I told y'all this was going to happen to Trump.
The reason, according to these reports again, why they are so desperate is because even though they are attacking Yemen, they're attacking Sanaa especially, the United States military, they're not able to stop Houthi attack on Israel, which was their primary goal go after the...
Come on, man. These people shut down Israel International Airport the other day. Had everybody running, screaming for their lives. Trump, you promised you would stop that. You promised you was going to protect Israel. He's a Zionist, warmongering, war hawk. And as long as he's doing that shit, we're going to stay on his neck over here. We don't play those games. See, we not like the bootlicking, buck dancing Greek freaks, the Divine Nine, who never criticized the Democrats when they was war hungry. We didn't ask for this, so we're going to criticize Trump. We didn't tell you bomb innocent people and talk tough. Lose more respect for us. We want you to gain some respect by making that deal with Vladimir Putin and bringing peace to the world. But he decided not to do that. Revolutionary salute to my brother James White for the donation to the war chest. Revolution is a way of life. I absolutely appreciate that love, family. You help me keep the lights on here at Cold Figure TV News Network. But so I got to tell the truth about Trump because we the only ones going to be on the record. Yes, we want him in the power. We want that Ukraine war to stop. We didn't want our sons to be transitioned. We didn't want men in the women's bathroom. That's the policies we was asking for. Since he want to be war hungry and want to be a maniac, we calling his ass out. And all of his humiliation is his alone. It's not ours. Those people who not calling Trump out, it's their humiliation too. We the only ones can keep our respect. Because when we put you in power and you go against our wishes, we call you out about that shit.
Houthis in Yemen. But that goal was not being met by any success. Rather, they're spending more money and they're sending more aircraft carrier, as I have mentioned in my other video, B-21 radar system and all kind of equipment and machineries that they need to counter Houthi threats against Israel. But they are not being so successful. United States, they want to continue on with this attack on the Houthis until they will be able to eliminate all threats coming from them. And again, this is coming at a time when Iran is also getting ready to be attacked by US. They issued joint statements with Houthis and Hamas and all of these proxies working for Iran, that they are going to be defending their countries, all of them together. And these people, for example, Akbar Abdullah, this guy, he is testifying to the fact that United States, they are randomly targeting Yemeni cities,
Yes,
Sanaa,
yes,
without
yes. As we go on with this information today, we're gonna be hearing from some of the presenters that we usually listen to. Random houses get hit. They trying to commit terror in Yemen. This is what the United States do. They trying to do what they allow Israel to do. What Trump and ambassadors gonna wind up saying is, oh, they're hiding military equipment under their hospitals, under their schools, under their apartment buildings. We're not gonna go for this. Trump is gonna become a war criminal if he keep this shit up.
achieving any objective, achieving any goal militarily. And this is what is making the United States military work uh, twice the number that they should be working as a force. Let's take a listen to what Yahya Sari is saying here.
Hypersonic ballistic missile. The operation successfully achieved its objective, by the grace of God, which led to the suspension of air traffic at the airport for more than half an hour. In response to the American aggression that carried out dozens of airstrikes on our country in the past hours, our forces, through the Missile Force and the Drone Air Force, engaged with the American aircraft carrier USS Harry Truman and several hostile warships in the Red Sea with a number of missiles and drones. The confrontations lasted for several hours. The Yemeni, Houthi, armed forces, relying on God, continue to confront this brutal and criminal aggression with determination, responding to escalation with escalation. We also remain committed to supporting the oppressed Palestinian people and disrupting Israeli navigation in the previously declared operational zone until the aggression ceases and the siege on the Gaza Strip is lifted.
Okay, so in the previous videos, I have also mentioned to you guys how this war is spinning out of control because Houthis, their capabilities, the leadership echelon is something that is very much an uncharted territory for United States military. It means they do not know how to target them, how to bring them under submission, and that's why they are firing randomly at the Houthis in Yemen, ending up killing women and children. In other words, you can say what Israel is doing right now in Gaza is what United States is doing at the moment in Yemen, because again, they do not have any intelligence to back up that attack their target on the ground. But again, United States military, they are getting ever more desperate, and they do not really have any end to this conflict in sight. Let me know your thoughts. I have some updates, I would say shocking updates, because according to this report from Mint, Trump, the reason he sent a second carrier to the Red Sea to confront Houthis is because USS Harriman, True Harriman, has been destroyed. Now, when I say destroyed, I don't mean they were pulverized. What I mean is that they were damaged to the point where they're not operational anymore. So what Donald Trump does, he is going to be sending, or he already sent, as we have discussed in our previous video, a second carrier to the Red Sea. And what you are seeing right now is Donald Trump getting on his plane, Air Force One, leaving Washington. But this is the situation right now. The aircraft carrier was destroyed beyond the point where they could actually do some repair on this. And Houthis, they are laughing at this. They are laughing at this and saying that these aircraft carriers, they are no good. And they mocked Donald Trump, and they made several statements as
You see, this
part
only
of our
warning.
response. So
This is
this
only a warning to the U.S., bro. You won't be parking aircraft carriers off of the coast of these countries like you've been doing in Africa. You did Libya, Middle East. That's over with, man. They got hypersonic missiles. They can touch your aircraft carriers. You don't have to put it on the news, but when you remove that aircraft carrier and you bring in another one, the whole world knows your aircraft carrier got damaged. I mean, it was struck. That's not the point. You're talking shit to Russia, China, Iran. They will definitely sink these aircraft carriers. 5,000 soldiers is on these aircraft carriers. They would definitely sink these. Venezuela could sink them. Cuba could sink them. That beating your chest, like I told Trump, that wasn't going to work. And if he don't humble himself and he dare even think about putting boots on the ground, that's going to be the end of his presidency. Now you go Vietnam in the Middle East. But this is the crazy part. That's what China and Russia want. See, that's bad news for Iran. They want the U.S. to get into a war that damaged the U.S. economy and hurt their military in the Middle East. China don't want them to do that in China. Russia don't want it near their border. So they probably going to pick a place to carry it out. And it probably going to be the Middle East with the Houthis.
Is coming from Houthis as part of a response to the American aggression on our country, and for the sixth consecutive day, the Air Force carried out a military operation targeting several warships accompanying the USS Harry Truman aircraft carrier with multiple drones, he added. So, coming from the Houthi spokesperson, Houthi leader claimed this US Harry Truman is now beyond any repair. They cannot be operational. And they mocked US reliance on aircraft carrier, calling them a burden and a danger. Uh, Donald Trump, he sent the nuclear powered warship. We have mentioned about that. And he's ramping up attack on the Houthis, but at the same time facing this kind of setbacks where his aircraft carriers are no good. Houthis strikes on U.S. warships, and U.S. recently extended USS Harry Truman's deployment amid escalating Houthis attack. But now that it had come under attack, Houthis attack, it has not been effective at all whatsoever. So URL Vinson, this is the nuclear powered warship, will join Truman in the region to create a two carrier presence, because again USS True Harriman has become a liability. This will mark the first two carrier deployment in CENTCOM since September of 2024. And things are just getting more and more escalatory. As I have mentioned, on Friday evening, the Israeli army announced that it had intercepted a missile launch from Yemen before it entered Israeli airspace, marking the second such incident in 24 hours. Last week, President Donald Trump said he ordered a decisive and powerful attack against the Houthis. And as you can see, this is how it is panning out right now, which is that it is becoming a complete disaster and a liability. These aircraft carriers, they are rendering to be totally a waste of time and money for United States. And mind you, that United States, they took huge pride in using this kind of aircraft carrier. In response, the group said Thursday, as to what Donald Trump said, that Trump's threats, quote, will not deter them from supporting Gaza. It means it will continue on. The war will be waged, and it was waged, and it is going to continue on. The last two carrier overlap in the region was in August 24 with USS Lincoln and Roosevelt. And I believe that USS Lincoln and Roosevelt, they came back to United States. They are not operating in the Red Sea anymore. This moves comes after Trump resumed airstrikes in Yemen, targeting the Houthis there. But again, guys, things are not looking good. Trump might send even more aircraft carriers. Who knows? Because he wants to see the end of it. Otherwise, it will hurt his ego big time.
Sanaa, capital of Yemen. And I even got a little bit of Sanaa for you here. This is part of the old city.
And what are you doing there, my friend?
Well, it's an outstanding story. In fact, personally, it's been 1 year that I've been trying to set up my own trip to Yemen. And we are a small group, in fact, part of a conference on Palestine, which started on Saturday morning. It's going to end tomorrow, Tuesday. Today, we had discussions with scholars, Yemeni scholars, who are drawing a sort of roadmap of what could happen next in terms of the whole Palestine tragedy and how can Yemen help. And of course, in the middle of all that is, for a pilgrim like me, I always dreamed of coming to Yemen. And obviously, this morning I went out walking by myself in the streets of Sanaa, and then I was politely arrested by the security because I could not do this by myself, right? And they freaked out completely. But the feeling of everyday life in the city, and this city has outstanding aspects that you think you are in the pre-Middle Ages or the late 19th century, early 20th century. But there is a feeling of normalcy. And now this is a country at war, of course. Today, this afternoon, late afternoon, we went to the site that was bombed by the Americans yesterday night. We didn't hear the bombing, but we listened to the sirens. And immediately afterwards, we knew that somewhere was hit. And it was like 2.5 kilometers from the hotel where we were staying, which is very close to the old city, which is the most.
We're going to play the video. We've taken the sound off because we can't hear your voice over all the.
Of course, yes. We did this in a rush.
You can describe to us what we're seeing, Chris. If you'd play that video.
Okay, thank you.
So where are you?
I am at the site of a residential building. There were only civilians inside. There was hit by American bombs yesterday night around 9 o'clock. And today, of course, we lobbied the security services to take us there. And we explained to them that the world needs to see these images. And if it's not for us, the small group of independents who are here, this will never be on American mainstream media or Western mainstream media. And I talked to the owner of this building. It was a 2-story building. It was, they were trying to refurbish it somewhat. There were only civilians inside. So far, the numbers that we have, 4 to 5 people died and around 11, 12 were injured. And in the street outside. So there's no military value whatsoever. And you can see by yourselves, these are some of the hills behind Sanaa. This is a residential area. It's, I would say, a lower middle class proletariat residential area.
What does the United States gain by bombing a residential area of the capital of Yemen?
Absolutely. No, it's even worse because it points to a dysfunctionality and a level of absurdity that is absolutely extraordinary, and compounded with the so-called leak that we had a few hours ago. Everybody here in Sanaa, diplomats, the security services, the guys who are guarding our perimeter, everybody read it. The narrative is that a leaked group chat showing how the Yemen war was planned. And we have quotes like Vice President Vance saying, let's make sure our message is tight, or the strongest reason to do this is to send a message, quote. So this is completely absurd. Can you imagine that these people were discussing launching a war on signal, which is an encrypted.
Listen to what my former Fox colleague, who is now the Secretary of Defense, said. Quote: "Nobody knows who the Houthis are." Close quote. So we must advanced the idea that, quote, Biden failed and Iran funded. Do you believe that? They're bombing people that the Secretary of Defense says nobody knows who the hell they are, and they're going to blame it on Joe Biden and on Iran.
Judge, obviously, he doesn't know who the Houthis are or Ansarallah is or what Yemen is.
But they on fake news talking about they killed the Houthi leadership. Bitch, you don't even know who the Houthi leadership is. You only seen the leader on TV. You don't know where he at. That's crazy. But see, Trump is a war criminal doing this, killing all those innocent people that we got Pepe over there on the ground. You bombing houses, residential areas, killing innocent people. Then going on TV talking about they bombed Houthi leadership. They took out weapons depots. They took out missile sites. Stop lying.
Is or anything about the history of Yemen, which is a people of warriors. Today, for instance, we were visiting the house of Imam Yahya, which is a 3,000-year-old, then rebuilt, of course. It's called the Stone House. And, of course, he's the heir of 3,000 years of history. And we were visiting that. This is an extremely sophisticated people who fought invaders, who fought until recently the Saudi, backed by America, UAE coalition, which was bombing parts of Yemen all the time, including the capital, Sanaa. 2 days ago, we saw one of the bombings in 2017 where they bombed a civilian gathering and killed over 1,000 civilians and over 2,000 injured. And we see the tap one, tap two, with our own eyes. It's completely absurd. And there's something that when you analyze the so-called leaked signal communication, by the way, signal is encrypted. So this was not leaked at all. This was somebody inside the group that decided to reveal, which makes it even more absurd.
Well, somebody inside the group, the Wall Street Journal intimates it was either Mike Waltz or Pete Hegseth, but somebody inside the group says that this reporter for The Atlantic was inadvertently or accidentally invited to join the group. He didn't even realize what was going on until he determined who he was listening to.
Judge, this is bullshit. This is total bullshit. He was part of the conversation, obviously. And maybe they did it. There was an express idea of let's leak this to a guy who is not part of our gang. As you know, the Atlantic is not part of Trump 2.0. And this editor is an absolute idiot. It was perfect in this time. But coming back conceptually to what happened, this group didn't think that the Houthis were a real threat. And it's not a matter of the Houthis being a threat. The Houthis are extremely capable militarily. If Hegseth doesn't know this, I'm sorry, but he's a joke. They didn't think that the Americans would understand these strikes. And in fact, nobody in the US understands why the Pentagon is striking against civilian targets in Yemen. And they did it anyway to send a message. And I'm quoting one of them. In fact, it's Vance. The strongest reason to do, quote, it's to send a message. So you go on Signal and you start a war to send a message. What is this? This is undefinable.
What is the attitude of the Houthis about Americans?
We were having, in fact, it's still going on, Judge, in a room like, not far from where I'm talking to you now, with a former prime minister who's now, he's even more powerful than the prime minister. He's the head of their political council. And he was explaining in detail the spiritual, religious, and moral necessity for Ansarallah, the Houthis, and this government, the government of Sanaa, to help the Palestinian plight and to help their brothers. They define the Palestinians as brothers. Right? And that explains, of course, the attacks on Israeli ships or ships delivering whatever that is to Israel, or ships who are helping Israel one way or another. And they say, look, and now that we restarted because the ceasefire was broken by Israel, if they stop with the ethnic cleansing project and the starvation of Palestine, we also stop it. The day before, very, very important. Yesterday, I was talking to another guy very, very high up in the political council here. I asked him point blank, do you have privileged channels of communication with China and Russia? He gave me a response that was fascinating because it was lost in translation, of course, but the bits and pieces that I could pick up, he was saying basically in metaphors that, of course we do, but we'll never advertise this to anybody. And the Russians and the Chinese know exactly what the US and Israel are up to in Palestine and against the axis of resistance. And of course, there are very close relations between Russia and China with certain vectors of the axis of resistance. And they understand that this is a much bigger war. They understand the full forever wars ethos when you think about US-Israel against the axis of resistance. And the people here in Yemen, they are very sophisticated. I was very, very impressed. Everybody that we talked to. And
do they have
yes,
an understanding of why the Trump administration is trying to kill them?
No, because they cannot explain it. And because there is no rational explanation. And this so-called leak today only confirms to them that the whole thing is absolutely irrational. To send them, just like that, to send a message. They're not a threat. But anyway, let's do it because we can. A typical imperial attitude, right? But you are messing with a nation of warriors. This is very, very serious. Yesterday, something absolutely extraordinary happened. We were stunned. We were in a divania, a room right behind me, in fact, waiting for the daily speech of the leader of Ansar Allah, Abdul Malik al-Houthi. And guess who enters our room? Out of the blue, the military spokesman of Ansar Allah, Yahya Sari, which is a face all over the world recognized as the face of Ansar Allah and the face of the Houthis. It was an immense risk for him to come here and visit a group of foreigners in a hotel.
Is that him there with you?
No, that's another guy, Judge. This was the guy that I was referring before. This is the guy from the political council where I asked the Russia-China question. Yahya Sari is the guy that we see every day all over the world. One of my friends here, Professor Ma from Huanzhou, he told me that Yahya Sari is immensely popular in China because the Chinese support the Yemenis. And there are instances of the relationship between China and Yemen coming back from Mao times. They took us, for instance, to an obelisk written in Chinese and in Arabic, paying homage to the Chinese workers who died here in Sanaa in construction works in Maoist times. So this goes back a long time. And part of our conversation a few minutes ago, he was telling us of the relationship that the Yemenis had with Nasser's army, for instance, and the fact that a lot of top students from Yemen, they studied in Soviet and Chinese universities. So this explains why these people, they can build a hypersonic missile. And if our friend Hegseth doesn't know any of this, oh my God, the US is in really, really bad shape.
I think the US is in really bad shape. I mean, you'll see the transcript of this, or not this, these conversations, and it's almost high school like.
It's high school, exactly. It's high school. And I would say that this high school concerning their how unprepared they are to understand Yemen mirrors the high school of certain elements they are negotiating with Ukraine and Russia as we speak. The same
now,
thing.
Well, where are you there? It looks like there's about 2 dozen microphones in front of you.
No, because this was the first day of the conference, and each of us, we had like 3 minutes for a short speech, and they took this photo while I was finishing my speech. And yes, everybody was there, Judge. CCTV, you know, RT, Press TV from Iran, etc. Yes, this is one of the pictures of the old city, which is look, I've been to all the souks in the Middle East over the last 40 years. It's the most beautiful ancient city and souk in the whole Arab world. It's something absolutely extraordinary. And that's why this morning I wanted to go there by myself. And I'll keep going in the morning or late at night by myself, just to walk the streets, feel the atmosphere. And you can talk to many of the merchants. So many of them speak at least the basics of English. It's fascinating. This is a group of boys. These are a group of Yemeni boys in the hood, dressed Yemeni style, with their dagger in the right place, right?
And who are these fellas?
Basically, some of them are dancers, some of them are artists, and we're gonna see a lot of them on this coming Friday, because there's going to be another one of those 1 million marches where they gather together to express their support for Palestine.
Now, what is this is one of the gathering? It looks like there's 1,000 people behind you, Pepe.
More, even more, Judge. This was on the first day of the conference, where our small group was sitting here in front, and these are militants, diplomats, intelligence officers, university students, you name it. And this was the first day of the conference where they gave the floor essentially to our small group of foreign. We are like maybe 11 or 12, including Professor Ma from China.
If you were to ask those people if they believe that Donald Trump is a man of peace, how would they react?
Obviously, considering the actions of the United States vis-a-vis Yemen so far, obviously not. But they don't make comparisons. It's a very different reasoning. They are extremely gracious, polite, understanding. They love to listen to points of view from other parts of the world. For instance, we have a Bolivian friend here, very close to Evo Morales. They are absolutely fascinated by everything that comes from Latin America. We have Professor Ma, who's a Muslim, a Hui, a Muslim from China, who speaks fluent Arabic on top of it. Obviously, he's treated like a superstar here, you know. So they know how to gather people from different parts of the world who understand not only how they are implicated in the Palestinian struggle, but their own struggle, because they were being bombed literally until yesterday by the Saudis and by the so-called coalition. The so-called ceasefire, the Saudis had to sign the ceasefire because they were being destroyed by the Yemenis, you know. So in terms of their military power, it reflects directly their spiritual strengths, their moral character, their moral clarity, which is something that we understand when we talk to them. It's very, very impressive. These people are models of rectitude, and they want to be on the side of the good, on the side of the communal good, which is something that in the West, as we all know, which is the reign of postmodernist narratives, disappeared completely. So when you come here, you are literally in another planet. And it's very fulfilling for all of us. We are learning so much, and our agenda during the day is absolutely crazy. We go all over the place, and I'm lobbying very, very hard to go to Hodeida, but they tell me that it's extremely dangerous at the moment because Hodeidah is being bombed by the Americans practically every day. They are cowards. They only bomb at night. But even to go there during the day, we still trying to convince the security people, look, let's go. We stay 1 hour, 2 hours. We talk to some people. We see the port, and we come back during the day before sunset. So I hope that's going to happen.
Do they share your view and mine and those of the people watching now that the United States is bombing them as a favor to the Israelis?
Yeah, essentially, yes. The attitude of the new presidency in the United States is viewed here essentially as a favor to Israel. And that redoubles their drive to defend Israel as best as they can. For instance, can you imagine anybody on the planet who has the balls to declare a blockade of Ben Gurion airport in Israel? They do it. And they launched their hypersonic missile on top of it.
And do they succeed?
Yes. The problem is, Judge, obviously, military information here, especially for us foreigners, is very, very difficult to obtain. For instance, I asked specifically about the mechanism, their decision mechanism in terms of coordinating their political bureau with the top of the Yemeni armed forces. They decide when they're going to strike, who they're going to strike, with what kind of missiles, weaponry, etc. I didn't get a straight answer. I'm going to keep trying during this week.
All right,
but
Pepe, if you want to come, if you want to come back on with us later in the week, if you have breaking news, if you have a revelation, if you have a story you want to tell us, just reach Chris and we'll put you on again, my dear friend.
Friday, Judge, after that famous 1 million march.
You
definitely,
got it.
Definitely.
We'll work it out. Thank you. Thank you. Very successful. Can you fathom what he meant by that?
Well, first of all, I don't have their target list. I don't have access to the battle damage assessment, so I'm not in a position to provide independent corroboration of what the president claims or to be able to directly contradict him. What I can say is this: knowing what I know about how this thing works, I would give it about a 98% probability that the president's words do not reflect reality, that the situation on the ground in Yemen is far different than the situation that he has been briefed upon. There's no doubt in my mind that the United States Central Command has identified points on the ground and that the U.S. Navy has put bombs on those points, and photographs show that those geographic points have achieved a certain level of battle damage. But I don't share any confidence that those points on the ground have anything to do with deterring or destroying the Houthis' ability to continue to carry out military operations designed to interdict shipping in the Red Sea or to strike targets in Israel, which should be the military mission of the United States, one would think.
It's funny you should say all that, Scott, because in an hour, we'll be interviewing our friend Pepe Escobar live from Yemen, and he has already sent us a video, which we will share, of course. And what does the video show? Destruction of residential neighborhoods. Doesn't show destruction of anything of any military value whatsoever. Why would CENTCOM destroy residential neighborhoods? Why would they target residential neighborhoods?
Well, again, I can only first of all, the targeting of the residential neighborhoods is beyond me, unless the president, President Trump, is notorious for creating liberal rules of engagement, basically untying the hands of the military so that issues of military necessity outweigh issues of collateral damage, or issues of whether or not, basically, are you getting the bang for your buck? I mean, everybody knows in wartime, the civilians pay a very heavy price. But generally speaking, the military is supposed to review targets to determine that if there are collateral casualties, that those casualties are commensurate with the military value of the target being struck. In the past, I have to tell you that the United States, at least when I was in, we would not knowingly strike a target that we knew were going to result in significant civilian casualties. We would deliberately avoid that target. Where accidents have been made, mistakes have been made, and of course, civilians have died in large numbers. We struck a bomb shelter during in Adamiyah in Baghdad during the Gulf War, killing hundreds of Iraqi civilians. But again, that was a mistake, an accident. Here, they're striking targets. Knowing what I know about Middle East procurement, and a lot of the targets that are being struck, I believe, are related to the Houthis' ability to procure materials from abroad. So you'll have export-import companies that will operate under various fronts for Yemeni intelligence, and we get a smattering of data here and there, and then we build target sets. I can tell you, in Baghdad, as a weapons inspector, I inspected a number of facilities that were located in the middle of residential areas. Many of them were former homes that had been converted to export-import groups that were responsible for buying military equipment from abroad. It's the paperwork. It's where the offices are. The equipment's not there. What I'm thinking is that, first of all, I don't think the United States has a tremendous amount of hard targeting. The Yemeni have been doing this for a long time, since the Houthi have been doing this since 2014. They've been working together with the Iranians. The Iranians are experts at going underground. I can guarantee you, whatever target deck we had about the Houthi or Yemeni armed forces and bases and such is no longer valid. It's been shuffled several times as the Houthi seek to relocate their relocatable targets. So I would imagine that our intelligence is out of date. I would imagine that as we bomb targets, we're desperately looking for new targets. So we pull up old intelligence that points us to places on the ground. A lot of times I went to inspect a facility that we thought was a export-import control, only to find that it had been shut down a year prior or 6 months prior and moved to a different location. Our intelligence doesn't update the target list, and as we expend targets, and we've been bombing for a long time, we run out of targets, I can tell you that. And so we go and we scrape the bottom of the barrel. So we're bombing targets that we have no confirmation. I can also guarantee you that our intelligence on the ground in Yemen is uniformly poor. The Houthi are a very insular group. We do not have the kind of penetration into the Houthi society, into their leadership, into their industry necessary to produce the kind of targeting that would be conducive to real-time targeting of value. So I believe our target decks are crap, excuse my language, and that we're blowing up targets that don't exist, that are incorrect. We know this because we're killing a whole bunch of civilians. We're blowing up a whole bunch of targets that have nothing to do whatsoever with interdicting the Houthis' ability to fire missiles. And these are what we call, relocatable targets, mobile relocatable targets. Historically, we have tremendous problems striking these. During the Gulf War, that was my war, was to try and hunt down and kill Iraqi Scud missiles. And I can tell you, despite diverting thousands of sorties and putting men on the ground and all this, we didn't kill a single one. And that's what's happening today. We're not killing anything except innocent civilians.
Well, somebody who agrees with you, and the president was very frustrated at this a few minutes ago, I don't know this person, is the editor of Atlantic magazine, Jeffrey Goldberg. Mr. Goldberg says officials in the Trump administration, you ready for this, Scott? Accidentally added him to a group text chat about strikes against the Houthis. CNN's National Security Council spokesperson Brian Hughes says the text chain appears to be authentic. He was as critical of the targeting as you were, and he claims to have had accidental access to the internal decision making. I'd like your thoughts on Mike Waltz. He was on one of his rants over the weekend. I really think these people are looking for an excuse to attack Iran, and I want to ask you about what that will do with the relationship between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. Chris, play these back to back, cut number 8 and then cut number 9.
We've seen the death and destruction that they're doing through its proxies between Hezbollah, the Assad regime, the Houthis, and what have you. If they had nuclear weapons, the entire Middle East would explode in an arms race. That is completely unacceptable to our national security. I won't get into what the back and forth has been, but Iran is in the worst place it has been from its own national security since 1979. Thanks to Hezbollah, Hamas, the Assad regime, and its own air defenses being taken out by the Israelis. Full dismantlement. Iran has to give up its program in a way that the entire world can see. And this is, look, as President Trump has said, this is coming to a head. All options are on the table. And it is time for Iran to walk away completely from its desire to have a nuclear weapon.
That type of bullshit disgusts me. That imperialist bullshit, and it's gonna be war behind that. Who the hell they think they're talking to? That type of white supremacy, can't tell Iran what they can and can't have, when they can and can't have it. Talking tough, threatening people, doing this for Israel, but pretending like this is for America. That's disgusting. All these people been designed to control our government. That's a problem.
And they will not and cannot be allowed to have a nuclear weapons program.
Even though their mortal enemy has a nuclear weapons program, it is doing everything it can to involve the United States in a war on Iran. What happens if the IDF and the United States attack Iran? What will Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin do?
Well, first of all, let me just start off by saying that Iran is a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and is obligated by law and by its own commitments not to have a nuclear weapons program. And as we speak, Iran hasn't been shown to have a nuclear weapons program. In fact, the International Atomic Energy Agency, even though it decries Iranian non-compliance, it's non-compliance with an inspection regime that was, attached to the Iran nuclear deal, which is no longer in place. So when the IAEA says Iran is in non-compliance, it doesn't mean that Iran is actively pursuing a nuclear weapon, but Iran has developed certain capabilities which, according to Iranian officials' own statements, could be brought together in a very short period of time to make Iran a nuclear capable state. And this is what Donald Trump and, of course, Israel are worried about. I will say that in my personal experience in negotiating with people from this region, that the Trump administration is taking the absolute worst approach. The Iranians will not back down. They will not concede to threats. I do believe that there's a window of opportunity there to get Iran to agree to reduce its uranium enrichment program, which would alleviate much of the concerns that Israel and the United States has. But we're taking the wrong approach. And so this will lead to confrontation if we don't change course. What will Russia do? Russia has a strategic framework, a security framework with Iran, but it's not a treaty. There's no Article 5 NATO-like protection where Russia will extend it to. But the United States is, as we speak, having parallel negotiations with the Russians, where we're trying to tell the Russians that we can be trusted, that we're worthy partners in peace and such, and then we turn around and are pushing for a war with Iran, where we have violated every agreement, where we have no legal framework to do this, no justification whatsoever to do this. And as you pointed out, the hypocrisy of seeking to hold Iran accountable for a theoretical nuclear program on behalf of Israel, which refuses to sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and has a nuclear weapons program that refuses to allow this program to be A, admitted, and B, brought under inspections. The hypocrisy is unreal. If we attack Iran, I think the foundation of trust between the United States and Russia will be shattered. That doesn't mean that we aren't going to move forward, but Russia would, I don't think, could ever trust the Trump administration, nor could anybody in the world. We want to have good relations with China. We'll destroy that. We will become literally that which Donald Trump said he didn't want us to become, a warmongering nation going out in search of enemies, getting ourselves bogged down in yet another Middle East conflict that kills, hundreds of thousands, costs trillions. And this one could dangerously go nuclear. The potential for escalation to the use of nuclear weapons is real because, as Donald Trump himself knows, and as Mike Waltz knows, when Trump was president last time, they did consider striking Iran. And one of the problems they faced was that our conventional weapons cannot penetrate Iran's underground nuclear facilities. So in order to take out Iran's underground nuclear facilities, we would need deep penetration, low-yield nuclear weapons, which Donald Trump ordered to be built and deployed. And today, these weapons are deployed and I believe are part of any targeting package that we're preparing to use against Iran, which would mean that striking Iran isn't just ripping up treaties. It means that the United States will break the taboo that's been in place since Hiroshima and Nagasaki on the use of nuclear weapons, and we will become, by definition, the worst nation in the world, the most evil nation in the world, the nation that, A, can not only not be trusted by anybody, but should be viewed as an enemy by everybody, and that's not a good place to be.
Does Mike Waltz know what he's talking about when he says Iran is in the worst place it's been in from its own national security since 1979? He seems to think that Iran would roll over if the Israelis and the Americans attacked.
Mike Waltz is repeating Israeli intelligence. This is an Israeli-based assessment that reflects what happened in Syria. We still don't know exactly how the Assad regime fell. We do know that the CIA, working with Israeli intelligence and a variety of other intelligence agencies, have been working to bring down the Assad regime. We also know that the CIA, with Israeli intelligence, British intelligence, others, have been working for decades to bring down the regime in Tehran. We know that in 2023, the summer of 2023, they actually executed a regime change plan, bringing a number of various groups to rise up against the regime after the death of the Kurdish girl in police custody. I spoke with former President Raisi in September of 2023, and he said that that uprising was the greatest threat to Iranian security since the revolution, since 1979. But here's the important thing. They beat it. They gathered together, they rallied, and they defeated it. So, I think Mike Waltz is buying into an assessment that's derived more from what he desires the situation to be than what the reality is. I mean, maybe they know what they're talking about. Maybe the regime is nothing but a house of cards, and if you huff and you puff and you blow, it will come tumbling down like Assad did. Nobody predicted Assad doing that. So you can't say that that Waltz and others are totally off base, because we have a precedent that just took place in December. But what I would say is that it's very dangerous to predicate your aggressive stance on Iran on the notion that this regime will collapse, because the history shows that it didn't collapse, and they have a lot of weapons. This isn't Syria, weakened nation, weakened military, etc. This is Iran with significant military power capable, as they've proven, of striking and destroying any American military base in the region. I just have to bring up the Al-Assad air base that got hit with a dozen precision-guided missiles that hit exactly what they wanted, and had the Iranians not warned us about this attack, would have killed hundreds of Americans. And Israel knows that their air defense shield doesn't work. The other thing is Mike Waltz is perpetrating yet another Israeli hype, which is that Israel somehow destroyed Iran's air defense systems in their brief little limited strike in the aftermath of True Promise 2. No evidence has been put on the table to back this up. The Iranians don't act as if that took place. The Israelis have provided no photographs or anything to back this up, nor has the United States. It's simply this hype put out there. I think a lot of what Israel and the United States are seeking to do is play a psychological warfare right now to make the Iranian regime unsure of itself and maybe therefore more conducive to engage in negotiations. And the last thing I'll say is this: Iran will never sit down with the United States, led by Donald Trump, that's behaving in this fashion. Iran will not respond to this. What Iran will do is talk to the Russians and the Chinese. And if Trump had a brain on his head, he would know that the Russians have actually set Iran up to achieve exactly the outcome that Donald Trump wants, but he's not going to give them a chance by this blustering attitude. The Houthi have withstood the American attacks, and Iran will withstand the American attacks. The difference is the Houthi can't strike back the way Iran can. Israel will pay an extraordinarily heavy price. So will the American military. And sadly, so will the Iranian people, especially if we use nuclear weapons.
Well, the American people are not being served well by Mike Waltz when all he does is mouth the Mossad propaganda. Which is the greater threat to peace in the Middle East, Iran or Israel? That's a no-brainer.
Israel. Israel is the greatest threat to peace and security in the world today, not just in the Middle East, in the world.
Over the weekend, the Hamas Health Ministry announced that 50,000 people have been killed by the IDF. The number didn't faze anybody, except, of course, the families whose loved ones died. Are we so attuned to Israeli slaughter that a number of that magnitude doesn't even make the front pages?
Judge, it's not Israeli slaughter. We're attuned to white people killing brown people. I mean, I'm just going to cut it down. When Madeleine Albright, back in the 1990s, I think 1995, 1996, was confronted by CBS News about 500,000 Iraqi children dying because of the sanctions the United States put on, she said, it's a price we're willing to pay. Now, just imagine that, an American Secretary of State saying it's a price we're willing to pay, about 500,000 children dying directly because of our policies. Now, if these were 500,000 Kosovo children or Albanians or white kids from Europe, America would be up in arms, the world would be up in arms, because you can't kill that many white people. You're not allowed to kill that many white people unless they're Ukrainians, and then apparently you can kill 1.1 million of them. But those are soldiers, not civilians. The idea of going in and bombing white civilians and killing them in this numbers is unacceptable. We do it to brown people all the time. We don't view brown people as being human beings. It's God's honest truth. Here in America, we don't. We don't equate black lives to be the equivalent of white lives. We're used to having black, the numbers of black health figures skewed out. And we say, well, that's just their problem. Their problem. They're human beings. It's our problem, a collective problem. It's the same thing we have when it comes to Arab Americans. We don't care. We can slaughter them by the millions, and we don't care because, my God, and I would sadly say, if we ever went to war in south of the border, we have zero regard for Mexican lives, or any brown lives. If you're not white, your life doesn't count. And I'm just being blunt, straight up honest. The American people can get mad at me and say I'm wrong. Look in the mirror and tell me I'm wrong. Tell me that you know deep inside your heart that a dead brown person doesn't move you like a dead white person does, because we are an inherently racist society, because we still believe in white supremacy. We still believe in the exceptionalism of being white, that somehow we are superior to others, and we're not. We have had the benefit of history. We've had the benefit of opportunity to where we do populate the upper tiers of society. But that's not because the color makes us inherently better. It's because the color has been attached to policies that have put the other people down, allowing us to rise to the top. And it translates into foreign policy. We would not allow Americans to bomb white people the way we're bombing Yemenis. And we wouldn't allow Americans to talk about putting nuclear weapons on nations populated by white people the way we're talking about the potential of nuclear. And I have to tell you, the whole Iraq experience exposed the racism of the United States. We just allowed that nation to be eviscerated, gutted, slaughtered, murdered, and nobody blinked an eye. The numbers just didn't cause any concern on the part of America. 500,000 Iraqi children. That's a price we're willing to pay. And if any American is okay with that or doesn't condemn it, we now know what the problem is.
Right. I mean, history teaches that the analysis you just gave us is sadly a correct one. We don't even have to go back through all the historical examples of this. When President Trump said we'll turn Gaza into Riviera in the Middle East, and we'll just find another place for these people to live. Your argument is this would never happen if the Gazans were white.
If we said we're going to turn Odessa into the Riviera, we'll just find a way to put those 5 million white Ukraine. We'll displace them. We don't care. Wouldn't happen. Wouldn't happen. We don't treat white people the way we treat brown people.
Are we preparing for war with Iran?
Oh, yes, we've been preparing for a long time now. Central Command has plans. Judge, we've been preparing forever. When I was in the Marines back in 1985, the summer of '85, I got a commendation because I rewrote the combat intelligence plan for the war plan to go into Iran. The war plan that we executed during Desert Storm was a modification of the war plan that would be used to flow in military equipment if we were, for instance, instead of landing in Saudi ports, if we were going to land in Bandar Abbas or Chabahar after forcefully taking them. We've been planning this and updating this war plan forever. It's one of the oldest war plans we have on the books. It's right up there with Korea, and so yeah, I think the problem is we don't have the resources to execute. I can guarantee you we don't have the resources today to execute the war plan that I was working on back in the 1980s, because that required hundreds of thousands of American forces to be flowed into the region, thousands of aircraft, ships that we don't have anymore. And that's one of the problems, is that we're preparing for something that we can't execute properly. And Trump again was briefed on this back when he was first president. He was threatening to bomb targets in Iran. He was told by his Secretary of Defense at that time, Mattis, that if he bombs them and it becomes a regional war, the United States, in order to prevail, would have to deploy 400 to 700,000 troops into the region that we don't have. It would take months, if not years, to mobilize those troops, and then we'd have to bring them into the region. And again, I want to remind people that we went to Desert Storm, or even when we invaded Iraq in 2003, our troops offloaded on the ports that weren't under fire. We landed at airports that weren't under fire. Trying to move hundreds of thousands of American forces into the Persian Gulf region today, every airfield we would land in would be destroyed or under attack. Every port facility we tried to offload on would be under missile attack. Our ships would be attacked as they closed in. A completely different scenario. So, yeah, I think we're preparing for war, but I also have to say we're not prepared for the war that we're preparing for.
Scott Ritter, thank you, my friend. Thank you for an extraordinary.
Right, so with the Gaza ceasefire having ended, with Israel committing atrocities throughout the Gaza Strip, so it is that not only have the Houthis of Yemen resumed their blockade of the Red Sea, and almost a full week now of strikes on US warships in response to airstrikes they have committed against Yemen, but they've also resumed their nightly rocket attacks on Israel, in solidarity with the people of Gaza, resuming the strikes they were enacting before the ceasefire, sending Israeli citizens scattering for the safety of shelters, disturbing their sleep, causing maximum nuisance and disturbance as their rockets invariably get taken out by Israeli defenses, either by accident or design. The Houthis have always claimed that their aims have been achieved, whether their rockets land or not, implying the disturbance aspect is the aim of the game most of all. The other day, I covered a strike on Ben Gurion Airport, though, a civilian target in Tel Aviv, one they have targeted before. There was much coverage debating whether or not the airport was actually hit as it got shut down, though this was later found to be as a result of debris as the rocket was once again intercepted. It seems to have given the Houthis a little bit of inspiration, though. They are already causing a blockade by sea. They are causing chaos over land, but now the plan is to interfere with Israel by air too, it seems, and what they've come up with might just be a stroke of genius. Right, so the ongoing genocide of Gaza by Israel took a dramatic turn over the last week with the resumption of rocket fire over Israel by the Houthi movement in Yemen, who, following their strike on Ben Gurion Airport several days ago, has now declared the Tel Aviv airport unsafe for international flights going forwards. It's a clever move. They don't actually have to fire another rocket at the airport at all if they don't want to, because they've proven they can reach it. And so by telling international airlines that fly to Tel Aviv, it's not safe for them to do so anymore, I've demonstrated exactly why. Who's keen to test it then amongst all of those airlines, I wonder? Well, the Houthis' actions here are explicitly aimed at inflicting economic damage on Israel in response to their genocide of Gaza. Tourism, a large part of Israel's economy, one that has suffered badly as a result of their actions in Gaza. It's an economy that is in absolute dire straits, with investors pulling out of business dealings. IDF reservists constantly being called up has been seeing small and medium-sized businesses that they run collapse. And other business people have been selling up and getting out of the country whilst they can, with other people shifting their finances and their pensions outside of Israel as their own nation's currency tanks. Hitting Israel in the pocket rather than literally with a rocket is a stroke of genius. And the hub that is Ben Gurion Airport, being threatened with a strike at any time and aimed at airlines too, could be their most damaging attack yet. And they may not, as I said, even need to fire another rocket at the airport if it puts enough people off flying there. That said, they've been firing rockets at Ben Gurion Airport again today as I was writing this, which was kind of them for my narratives anyway. Anyway, the Houthi movement, or Ansar Allah, has long positioned itself as a staunch opponent of Israel and an ally of the people of Palestine following the events of October 7th, following the genocide Israel began in Gaza in the aftermath of that attack. Since the end of the Gaza ceasefire, the group has renewed its efforts to challenge Israel's military actions in Gaza by targeting military infrastructure or open spaces, enough to trigger the air raid sirens in Israel, enough to cause disturbance, if no actual significant damage. Following the attack on Ben Gurion Airport, we saw their rocket taken down by Israeli air defenses earlier this week, Israel's Iron Dome, perhaps some of this rocket fire testing that once more to see how Israel may have possibly rebuilt the ailing system during the Gaza ceasefire. The Houthis succeeded in shutting down the airport for a few hours due to debris falling. And it seems this gave them a bit of an idea because they've now declared Ben Gurion Airport unsafe for international flights, warning that any airlines operating in Israeli airspace would be targeted themselves as well now. Having proven they can shut the airport down, they are now threatening to do so at any time. And clearly they seem capable of doing so. Perhaps that's what their rocket attacks today are all about, just making that point abundantly clear. The Houthis' targeting of Ben Gurion Airport is not an isolated incident. I don't believe it comes out of a desire to target civilians specifically either, else they would target civilian areas far more commonly than they have ever seemed to have done previously. And I also take that point because I've noted the rescuing of crews from the shipping they crippled in the Red Sea blockades as well. There doesn't seem to be any desire to deliberately target civilians, though obviously what they are doing invariably carries that risk, that significant potential. The targeting of this airport now, though, seems to be part of their latest move as part of a broader strategy to undermine Israel's ailing economy. It's why they started the shipping blockade, after all, and isolate it more internationally, putting off people from wanting to visit, as if Israel isn't doing a good enough job of that on its own, but also rendering it unsafe to just potentially fly there. And that will give airlines pause for thought as much as passengers, not wishing to risk their planes, not necessarily economically viable to fly there going forwards if the flights are not turning a profit, not enough people on them. Therefore, by declaring the airport unsafe, the Houthis could successfully deter international airlines from flying to Israel, cutting off a critical lifeline for the country's economy, which is already on its backside. Ben Gurion Airport is Israel's primary international gateway. It handles millions of passengers and billions of dollars in cargo annually. Any disruption to those operations carries crippling economic consequences, not only for Israel's tourism industry, but also for trade and commerce. Israel's economy is heavily reliant on international trade and tourism because it doesn't get on well with neighboring states. You might be a little surprised to hear that, and does little trade with them as a result, comparative to further afield. Both of these specific industries, however, depend on the smooth functioning of its airports. In 2022, before all of this genocide kicked off in Gaza, Israel welcomed over 2.5 million tourists, contributing significantly to their GDP. The tourism sector alone in Israel accounted for nearly 3% of GDP, and it employed tens of thousands of people. And so much of that has now been threatened with so much redundancy. A prolonged closure of disruption of Ben Gurion Airport would make that even worse. It would deal another severe blow to that sector. On top of that, caused by the genocide of Gaza already since 2023, leading to even more job losses than we've already seen and even more of a decline in revenue. Israel's high-tech industry, I've done videos on this one before, a cornerstone of Israeli economy, relies on the efficient movement of goods and people as well. Many of Israel's tech companies have global operations and depend on air travel for business meetings, conferences, and collaborations. Any disruption to air travel would hinder their ability to compete in the global market, potentially leading to further loss of investment and innovation, these companies packing up and going somewhere else. The Houthis' declaration also has some psychological implications. By targeting Ben Gurion Airport, the group aims to create a further sense of insecurity and instability in Israel, much as they do with their rocket attacks overnight when disturbing people's sleep. It makes people feel more insecure, deterring foreign investors and businesses from operating there, as further insecurity would. And that in turn could lead to a decline in foreign direct investment, and it would further strain Israel's economy. The Houthis' declaration regarding Ben Gurion Airport came on the heels of a series of rocket attacks on Israel, including 3 straight nights of alarms being set off by incoming rockets, those overnight strikes. The rocket barrage on Tel Aviv, which marked the first such attack on the city in months, was widely seen as a symbolic act of defiance at the time, aimed at demonstrating the Houthis' continued capability to retaliate despite Israel's apparent military superiority. But they kept going with it. It will also be a source of embarrassment for Israel that Houthi rockets can still reach that far before being intercepted, so their Iron Dome can't have recovered that much, surely. Well, the rockets have caused minimal damage and no casualties. They have disrupted daily life and forced many Israelis to seek shelter. This in turn has put additional pressure on the Israeli government to respond to the threat, potentially escalating the conflict further, and of course the US has come to their aid on such matters because of course they have. So in addition to their rocket attacks on Israel, the Houthis have also been keeping up their attacks on the USS Harry S. Truman, that US Navy aircraft carrier deployed in the Red Sea. Because of strikes launched on Yemen by the US, which have targeted civilian areas and infrastructure, it made the Truman a target for them. Over the course of 6 straight days, the Houthis have launched naval attacks on that ship using drones and missiles. And all of this has demonstrated the group's willingness to not only confront Israel, but also its allies, no matter who they are, no matter what they face, including the United States, no matter how big or powerful the target. Honey badgers they've been described as, and I really do think that nickname fits. Whatever your views here of what the Houthis are doing and have done, whether you agree with their methods or not, they have to be understood within the context of Israel's genocidal acts in Gaza, as well as the Houthis themselves, who will not back down from what they are doing, driven by their faith as they are to continue no matter what, something Western capitalist governments just can't grasp the concept of. And this is especially relevant given the crushing poverty in Yemen, and yet the majority of the people in Yemen still support what is being done here in their name by the Houthi movement. The collapse of the ceasefire and the resumption of hostilities have exacerbated the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, drawing widespread condemnation from the international community, but little action as per usual. But that is not the case with the Houthis, and as much as the violence by any side is condemnable, with so little diplomatic success, it's little surprise matters remain where they are. By effectively declaring Israel's largest airport a no-fly zone, though, the Houthis may have struck a heavier blow here than any of their previous rocket attacks ever have. For more on the story of the Houthi strike on Ben Gurion Airport the other day, which really did cause absolute chaos, check out all the details of that story in this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch.
Structure and stop giving Israel money. You're absolutely spot on. I couldn't agree more. So I have information from her regarding the time, and I will let you know. So, but before I'll do all this, if of course this is your first time in, let's do some. What I was going to do today is I'm going to do some headlines for you because there are some moving parts that you also need to consider. So here's the first one, which, you know, it might shock you, it might not. To me, it doesn't, because I know that this country is playing both sides anyway, despite what they say, because I never trust them anyway. Let me get the picture, and we'll just go from there. Here is the picture right here. And I give, by the way, I give credit to this picture to the Army Technology website. That's what. So what are you looking at? This is Saudi Arabia. Actually, the US approves the sale and the Saudis approves the purchase of the precision weapon system that the United States is going to sell to the Saudis. So this advanced precision weapon system is to be sold to the Saudi kingdom, which is the picture you're looking at is a laser guided missile capable of hitting air and ground targets. Okay, here is my question to you. If the Saudis are buying this many weapons, why aren't they helping the Palestinians? And by the way, this deal just by itself is about $100 million. So, and this was confirmed by the State Department, U.S. State Department, that the deal, here is what it says, and I quote, because I keep the quote for you guys, will enhance Saudi Arabia's ability to confront current and future threats and enable it to strike targets with precision while reducing the risk of damage compared to other guided missile systems. End of quote. You all know it's nothing but hoopla into all this, because when the war was against the Yemenis and the Houthis were able to fire missiles inside Saudi Arabia, the US Patriot missile systems was unable to defend the Saudis against it. So what makes them think that buying this precision guided missile is going to be like sort of protect them? No, it's nothing but hypes. But it highlights to you the double standards of the Saudis and some other Arab and Muslim countries, which I'm going to be addressing. So next one has to do with, where is he? Oh, I didn't get his picture. No, I did. Lil Marco with Netanyahu. What happens? Netanyahu called Lil Marco resuming to let him know that, hey, we're going to be resuming the war in Gaza, or on Gaza, that is. So, and that's what I said to you last time, guys. Remember when we were talking about ceasefire, whatever? And I remember telling you, mark my word, it's not going to hold. And here we are. So, and this is what Lil Marco is now pushing for. So the statement from Bibi's office, Netanyahu that is, called the U.S. Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, to discuss resuming the war in Gaza Strip and the return of the detainee prisoners. No. Well, here is the hard truth. What the media here in the West is not disclosing. Actually, it is disclosed within Israel, but not here. The massive demonstrations that's going on inside Israel, as a matter of fact, the protesters or demonstrators wanted to storm the house of the prime minister. I think Israel is descending into some civil war of sorts. So, but anyway, that's just my take. And the last thing I want to share with you, it has to do with the Rachel Reeves, and I give credit to Reuters for this picture. Rachel Reeves, she is the finance minister in the UK. Why is this important? Because here is what Britain now is going to do. It's pledging to adhere to the financial rule despite Trump's war trade tariffs. That's not about that. No. The British Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, said on yesterday, that the government will stick to its financial rule despite global turmoil, raising the prospect of thousands of public sector job cuts in a budget review this week. You know what it means? They are already carrying about 10,000 jobs in the public sector. Oh. And last October, Reeves sought to win the investors' confidence by pledging to balance the daily spending with the tax revenue. You all know where Britain is headed. Britain is going into bankruptcy, and the economy is sinking down. So, despite what you hear, and I just wanted to let you know about these developments here. So, all right, let's get into our topic. Well, it became now confirmed that Iranians have rejected the U.S. Call for so-called negotiations on the nuclear deal. So it came through its Iran foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, said that his country will not enter into direct negotiations with the U.S. At the same time, while he was saying this, at the same time, the Houthis are continuing to target Ben Gurion airport. As a matter of fact, for the second, in the last 40 to 72 hours. I give credit to this picture to from the archives of the Shutterstock. So, because you give credit where credit is due. So you can see how the airport is deserted. Why? Because it came to a complete halt. So when the Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, said that his country will not enter into direct negotiations with the US, at the same time, Ansarullah, or Houthis, it's known both in the West here, to target Ben Gurion airport for the 4th times in 72 hours. And here is the thing. The Houthis, or Ansarullah missiles from Yemen, targeting Israel despite US threats. So what I'm going to do in this live here, guys, I'm going to tackle two directions. One on the Iran negotiations and the other one on the Houthis. This way, it provides you with a better understanding of the big picture. So let's talk about the Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi's statement. So this statement was issued yesterday that the nuclear agreement in its current form, it's not going to work for the Iranians. And rightly so, because they had a deal, as you know, back in 2015. In 2018, the United States pulled out of the JCPOA unilaterally. So, and now Iran's saying, why should we even consider talking to you again? So, and at the same time, here is what the interesting aspects of this. Mr. Abbas Araghchi also mentioned that Iran's nuclear situation is progressing significantly. So he's hitting two birds with one stone. One is to hit at the US lack of credibility, which will cement that around on the global stage. And second one is to ensure that we are moving forward with the nuclear process or program, whatever term you want to use, to the point that, you know, we're not going to be intimidated what the US is saying. And this is why this decision came in, or this announcement rather, from Mr. Abbas Araghchi, that they're not going to be willing, the Iranians not willing to negotiate directly with the United States. It's because if Iran to do this, because he can no longer return to the terms of the nuclear agreement before. It's not in the interest of Iran, because if they do, the US will turn on them again. So, however, Iran left the door open a little bit, and that door is that they could consider an indirect negotiations with Washington, which is usually not a good way for the Americans, not the Iranians, because Iran's tactical approach is moving forward. So, and this is what the timing of it. So, because now, according to the Iranian foreign minister's statements, and I quote here, Tehran's priorities are neutralizing the sanctions that the enemy uses against us to achieve its goals. That's one of the first things. If the United States wants to negotiate with Iran, US needs to lift the sanctions first, because there were no sanctions by the time the deal has been reached in 2015. And this is why, at the same time, Mr. Araghchi is mentioning that his country wanted to avoid the war and does not seek it, but it is prepared for it and is not afraid of it. Those are strong messages to the Americans. And I can't stress enough, you know, because what Donald Trump is doing He's dragging us into another war. This is the guy who said, oh, by the way, here is what he said on November 4th, the final day of his re-election campaign. This is what Donald Trump said in a rally in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and made the pledge, said, and I quote, "I will restore peace in the world," he said, as supporters waved signs that reads, "Trump will fix it." Where is it? Because now, 2 months into his second term, all we are seeing that Mr. Trump has carried out this series of large-scale military actions against Ansarullah or the Houthis, killing at least 53 people, if not more, but at this time. So it makes you just wonder about the double standards. And this is why I always say, American presidents has no power. You know, you're still sending $18 billion to Israel. You're still giving green light, or you give the green light to Israelis to resume the war. I mean, when this is going to stop? And yes, you're saying you want to bring peace. And this is what I believe Mr. Trump miscalculated. He miscalculated, thinking that he's going to intimidate the Houthis. You know what my belief is? Is that Yemen is going to become the next Vietnam for the U.S. Because they have no options now. The U.S. has no options. The only other option left, in my opinion, is to renegotiate or negotiate through a third party or behind the scenes, which I will not rule that option out. So, and I'm going to get into the Houthi aspects. I want to finish the Iran part, then I'll move into the aspects of this. So, as I said, what the Iranians now are evaluating is to see whether the U.S. is going to be sucked in, which is already is, into Yemen, because that's going to move the sort of give at least breathing room for the Iranians to figure. But it is my belief that Iranians have already a strategy and plan in place, because they run this scenario, what if? And as I always say, as one who's been reading and doing a lot of writing regarding West Asia or the Middle East, Iran is not Iraq. Iran is not Saudi Arabia. Iran is not Jordan. Iran is not United Arab Emirates. Or even I compare it to Turkey. So it behooves the United States to think twice. It behooves Mr. Trump to think twice about targeting Iran. Because that, if we do, it's going to go outside the borders of the region. And end up being, but again, you're going to have to think about the people that voted for Mr. Trump. You know, if that is what they want, this is what they're going to get. Simple as that. So now, all this statements by the Iranians coincided with the Yemen's Houthi group, or Ansarullah, that is, statements that was issued yesterday. That's when it was issued, yesterday. And this statement has to do with targeting the Ben Gurion airport with the Palestine 2 hypersonic missile. So now, this is for the third day. This is what Yahya Sari, spokesperson for the group's military, you saw his picture right here. That's the one that it said that they targeted Ben Gurion airport in the second occupied Java region, and that the operation, and I put in quote, was successful and led to the suspension of air traffic at the airport for more than half an hour. End of quote. You know, you give this guy credit. You give Yahya Saree a credit, because he didn't lie. He didn't say that he hold traffic for 3 hours, 2 hours, for half an hour. And that tells me about how accurate and honest his statement is. So now, when you think about this, what Sari, the spokesperson, Yahya Saree, in Arabic it says Saree, in English we say Sari, because the double AA, the equivalency of English into Arabic, is letter Ain. For those who speak Arabic, you know what I'm talking about. So what Mr. Saree said also is that, and I quote, we will continue rather to support the oppressed Palestinian people and prevent Israel navigation until the aggression stops and the siege on Gaza is lifted. Once again, this is the request they are asking. They are not about to target Israel and US. They don't want all that. But they put a condition, and that condition is that Israel will lift the sanction, the blockade on the Gaza, and let the aid move on and maintain the ceasefire agreement. So, and this is where it becomes problematic for Israel, more so than the US. Of course, the US will be in a delicate position as well. But now any attacks on Israel is because of the US. So this is why Bibi Netanyahu is coming to the US next week. And this is why you have the likes of Rubio here supporting, because if you know about Rubio's political career, he was funded by AIPAC. No, there's no secret. It's not a secret. It's well-known information here in the US. But this is where you have to understand the Houthis' attacks on the airport of Ben Gurion, and I got the picture here for you. Ben Gurion Airport. And as I said, it came to a halt completely. It's because the Houthis mentioned that on Sunday, yesterday, that we will follow with our attacks as it did in the last 72 hours. Because the Sunday attack that took place yesterday is the fourth, following the group's announcement at dawn on Saturday that it has targeted it for the third time. So on Sunday was third time, on Sunday is the fourth. So, and on Sunday, here is where it gets very, I'm going to share a clip with you because you need to hear it for yourself. And also will provide you my own assessments of this. And I'll let you decide. Before I do this, I need to continue on this one here. Here is what the Israeli military or army said. Here is what they said. They said that they intercepted the missile launch from Yemen before it penetrated the Israeli airspace. Okay, if they're saying this, so why 2 Israelis were moderately and seriously injured when air raid sirens sounded in Tel Aviv? Take a listen here, guys. Okay, I just wanted to share this with you for you to see with your own. If they're saying they have down this, then why all of a sudden people are so what they say versus what it is are the opposites. So, and as a matter of fact, even Mr. Yahya Saree, which he posted on his believe it or not, he has an X account on the let me get it for you here because I want you to see it with your own eyes. Let me share screen. And I'm going to read it for you guys. So, after the success of our Yemeni armed forces in cutting off Israeli shipping in the Red Sea, a blockade is imposed on Ben Gurion Airport is occupied Palestine. A warning is issued to all airline companies to avoid Ben Gurion Airport for everyone's safety. Very, very interesting statements Why is this? It's because most of the airlines diverted their flights except for one country. And you know which country was it? Turkey. Turkey kept its flights to Ben Gurion. It shows you Turkey playing both sides. Like I always say, the Muslim countries are playing both sides. That's why you can't trust this one. Let me first say thank you to Fred Ball. And I can't thank you enough, Fred, for your continued support. It means a lot to me, and I'm very grateful. You wrote, whatever happens to people in HS, they can die in peace given they fought for the right cause, unlike those Muslim countries or flip-flop Tulsi. How can you live with yourself like that, knowing the truth? Spot on. I couldn't agree more. Spot on. Couldn't agree more. Much appreciate you for your support. And like I said, here is one airline that is continuing the flight, which is Turkey. Why the heck are you doing that? So if you are to show support for with the rest of, but Muslims, they just talk. Muslim leaders, that is. That's what I'm saying. So basically, with the attacks of the Houthis, all the landings and takeoffs at the David Ben Gurion International Airport in Tel Aviv were halted, and planes attempted to land were forced to continue flying after air sirens sounded. That just shows you where things are. And speaking of the Muslim, here is one thing I want to get ahead of it before I forget. Is this one right here? Look at this picture. Right there. What this one here is that the Arab League now is calling on all countries to end economic and military relations with Israel. Let me just tell you something. Are you going to trust what they're saying? You know, don't. They're saying one thing and they will do the opposite, because behind closed doors, they will still maintain their ties with Israel and, of course, do the U.S. or follow U.S. orders. Because here is the thing. Should there be a war, or should the U.S. attack Iran, where do you think those attacks is going to be launched from? It's going to be launched from the bases that are in Bahrain, in Kuwait, in United Arab Emirates, in Qatar, in Saudi Arabia, in Jordan, in Turkey. Despite what you hear. That's why you can't trust what the Arab and Muslim leaders say. So they're saying, well, we're going to end the economic and military relations with Israel. Okay. Why didn't you end this when the conflict started about a year and a half ago or so? Where were you? When Israel put sort of blockade on food and water, which is like a basic human needs. So where were you? Where were the Arab? Where were the Muslims? None of them even condemned whatever. And that's why when you hear these summits and all that, it's nothing but a consumption of ink, no more, no less. So now let's go back to our conversation about the Houthis targeting Ben Gurion, but I'm going to move it from another angle. And this one has to do with the United States decision to send now another aircraft carrier. This is the Carl Vinson. Now, the Carl Vinson sort of it's a how do I explain it? Because I don't want to get into the technical aspects of it and so forth. So the Carl Vinson is another another aircraft carrier that moves around with accompanying destroyers, and now is joining in the Red Sea and conduct exercises, not exercises, but rather targeting. And where is coming from? This one, the Carl Vinson, is coming from the recent exercise been conducting in East China Sea with the Japanese and the South Koreans. So this is an old picture of Harry Truman's aircraft carrier arriving at NATO Marathi Pier complex in Suda Bay. And Suda Bay is in Greece. And this was in February 6th, 2025. And this was a scheduled port visit. But my point in all this, it's not about the point is that now it became clear that the Harry Truman aircraft carrier couldn't defeat the Houthis or stop the missiles, to the point the US now is sending a second aircraft. This, in my opinion, is not strength. This is weakness. You are sending two major aircraft carriers against a group that you think will be unable to challenge you. And here we are. If you only guys know the cost of moving an aircraft carrier or flying an F-35 or S-437 or what have you, they cost a lot of money to move. And yet you couldn't defeat them. That's the point. This is where I see the challenge for the US, because Donald Trump miscalculated. Donald Trump doesn't know. Donald Trump is a showman. To those Americans that, it's your decision. If you happen to be an American watching this, it's your decision if you voted for Trump. You're free to vote for whomever you want, but you live with the consequences of it. Now you see why I didn't vote. And I have no intentions of voting ever. Because what are you going to vote for? Democracy is corrupted. Let's just be honest about it. And I'm not saying something that is not known already. So when Trump is saying, I am going to bring peace, and all of a sudden you're launching a text, that tells you right there who controls the process, who controls the decisions. Trump is just for show. Yes, he will do one little thing here and there for domestic consumption, like immigration, like getting rid of the education departments, whatever. Yeah, all that is great. Like what Timeline Dunkley said at the beginning. How about Mr. Trump fixing the problems right here at home? But now this becomes even a bigger problem for him. And the problem is that he did not expect this pushback by the Houthis or Ansarullah. And this is why the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, now ordered a Harry Truman carrier strike group to stay in the region for another month. That shows you right there what the plan is. So is Mr. The Secretary of Defense the same guy who is now going to be heading out to the Philippines? You all know why he's going to the Philippines, and after that to Japan. And I'm going to do, actually, I'm going to do a video for you about this, but I'm going to also discuss this one with Professor Anna Moundock. You all see what's coming. Like I always say, look over the horizon as to where things lead. But I don't think so the US will be capable of managing two fronts, one in the Red Sea and create a new one in the South China Sea. And this is why the question will become is, should this move forward, how will China react or respond to this? And this is my question for you guys. In your opinion, should the US move to the South China Sea? Do you think China should respond with force? Yes or no? If you will be kind in sharing this on the chat box. Because this is what I see going, guys. And it concerns me a great deal. It concerns me a great deal. So, yeah, let me see in the chat box your answer. Okay, Dave H, you say no. Jamie Dodger, you say yes. Kosim Garan, you say yes. Al Stalokin, it's time. YT, you say not necessarily. Vad Iban, you say yes. Dev, you say please create a poll. Okay, I will create it for the community. It's just for now. I just wanted to get a quick feedback here to highlight to you where things might be moving forward. Because here's the thing: when you think about the Houthis or Ansarullah, what they have done so far, here's what they have done. And even now, even the National Security Advisor, Waltz, I have a picture of him, another bonehead also. What he's saying is that, which is true, but also he's saying it from not wanting to accept the facts and the reality. And the facts and the reality is this, is that the Houthis have forced now 75% of American ships to avoid the Red Sea. This is what he said during an interview in Washington, D.C. And that 3/4 of U.S. shipping traffic that should pass through the Red Sea is currently forced to bypass the region and pass through the southern coast of Africa due to Houthi strikes in Yemen. 75% of our U.S. flagged cargo has to go through the southern coast of Africa instead of the Suez Canal. Just let that sink in, and it gives you an idea right there. And this is why I am convinced now that if Trump will continue on this path, as far as bombing Yemen and all that stuff, it's going to become another Vietnam. And his legacy is going to go very bad. It's going to, because as a matter of fact, the polls, I read somewhere, the polls are start to show a decline of Mr. Trump's popularity. No American president, to my knowledge, and if I am wrong, guys, please correct me, but to my knowledge, no American president has ever reached like 75 or 80%, give or take. So Trump now is going the other direction. And this is where it became clear as to the idea that we're going to just target the Houthis. No, because the Houthis were prepared for all this. And anytime the U.S. conducts an attack on the Houthis will launch something into Israel. And now it's an open, per se. And we are talking about all this without even adding Iran to the picture. That's why I'm saying, I can't stress enough that it behooves Mr. Trump to think twice about going even further with this. Because he dug himself into a hole. He's not coming out of it. It's a trap now. He's trapped. Why? It's because of the thinking of the superiority mindset. Oh, they just whatever. We're gonna. No. You have no idea about how fierce the Houthis are, or the whole idea about Yemen writ large. And this is where the challenge for Mr. Trump is. Now, all this coincided, of course, with the Israelis relaunching the attacks on Gaza. Brutal. It's to me, it's kind of like what's the word I'm looking for? Your truth cannot be cherry picked. You have to speak the truth. And what's going on right now is beyond self-defense. Is beyond, And where is the Arab and the Muslim world that they're just watching? Oh, we're gonna boycott the or cut off the economic ties with Israel. Really? So what happened to the Saudis buying billions of U.S. weapons? Jordanians, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, all of them buying this. Morocco's buying this. Egypt, Tunisia used to be at that time. So, and this is why now you are noticing massive demonstrations around the world. I'm going to share some pictures with you. This is from the city of Strasbourg in France. This is another demonstration in Spain. So here is another one in Paris, and it says right there, Vivre à Gaza tue, which means basically living in Gaza kills, meaning if you live in Gaza, you die. So here is another one in London. I have another one here for you. There is one in Morocco. The support for the Al-Aqsa and Palestine is from the religious duty, min Samim ad-Din, basically a religious duty that is. But again, you don't get misled by those demonstrations and so forth, because you have to understand, this one is in Paris, by the way. This, you have to understand the bigger context of all this. You know, governments will allow this kind of to divert attention. This is what I meant by misleading. So when you hear about the Arab League calling on all to end economic and military relations with Israel, no, it's nonsense. Because if it were the case, you have the 4 countries that have relations with Israel: United Arab Emirates, Jordan, Morocco, and what was the 4th? Jordan, United Arab Emirates, Egypt, and Morocco. 4 of them. You know, they could have cut off the diplomatic relations. So that's, to me, will make more sense. But they won't do it. They won't do it. So, and the other Arab nations, the likes of the Saudis, the Bahrainis, the Qataris, Egypt, and so forth, they just talk, no more, no less. You know, because like I always say, what the Houthis have now exposed 2 main things. One is the hypocrisy of the Arab and Muslim world, and 2 is that they are able to challenge the mighty American military power. Yeah, with all our might, you know. I mean, you move in an aircraft carrier with all its vessels and the destroyers and all that, and you couldn't defeat the Houthis. You know, that's to me the bigger message and where things are headed. But we have to think in terms of what if, because you always have to run that scenario. What if the craziness of Trump, or what if he is pressured to go ahead and strike Iran with Israel? What are the possible scenarios? So, because there will be scenarios into all this. So, and at this point, the only other thing that I can at least see based on the reading of the landscape is that the military installations of the US will be targeted, and Israel will be targeted with missiles, because Iran's missile technology and range far exceeds those that the Houthis have. And once that happened, it's going to become very problematic for the host countries, like, for example, Qatar, like, for example, Bahrain, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt, Turkey. You get the idea. Because Iran, it's not gonna, you kind of like, they become, they meaning US military installations become legitimate targets. And that is where my fear and my concern is, that Mr. Trump thinks that he can bully his way by escalating. Well, the Houthis already mentioned this. If you escalate, we will escalate as well. And they are true to their word. They didn't back down. For the last 72 hours, they attacked Ben Gurion airport. That tells me they're not backing down. That tells me they are not being intimidated. That tells me they are not scared of that. That tells me they will challenge the Americans, but also it tells me the optics of it on the global stage. And you think we're going to fight the Chinese? Really?
Yeah, right.
This is why Hegseth is going to the Philippines, is because he wants to really push Marcos into the front line, meaning create some scrimmages with the Chinese vessels on the South China Sea, and we will support you and defend you. This is how it's going to start. Same with Japan, same with South Korea, same with Australia. But for now, the visit is limited to those 2 locations, to my knowledge, because I confirmed it. Philippines and Japan, with other stop in Hawaii and another one in Guam, which, by the way, if you know anything about Chinese missiles, they are within reach to Guam. So that is my point in all this, guys, because I need you to see the big picture as to what lies ahead. And the idea that Mr. Trump is just arguing for threatening Iran with 2 months. I give you 2 months, or the Houthis, for that matter, that I'm going to destroy you. I'm going to wipe you out. No, man. What are you talking about? That kind of language doesn't work, let alone coming from so-called the president. President doesn't. But again, Trump is not You all know. You all know. So yes, there are some here in the US that they are supportive of Trump. There is no problem with that. If you want to support guys, support him. It's your prerogative. But at least, do you have an understanding? Again, most of those people, you ask them about where Yemen is, they won't even know. So, as a matter of fact, we are not good at geography or history. And that is why I wanted to do what I want to do in this channel by providing you information and knowledge that can help you decipher the complexities of what geopolitics is all about. Because what you are witnessing right now, yes, in a military realm, in a military dimension, but it is tied to what geopolitics is all about. And if you don't have that basic understanding, things will not make more sense to you. So, and that is my point in all this one.
It is March 24th, 2025, and tensions continue to increase between the US and Iran as you have the Trump administration trying to figure out its messaging on Iran, it seems, trying to play a game of good cop, bad cop, where one moment you have the Trump administration saying that they want to work with Iran, that they want to pursue some sort of nuclear deal, some sort of peace talks, if you will. And then the next minute, they're turning around and they're threatening Iran, saying that they are going to take an even harsher approach than the Obama or Biden administration. But when it comes to the question of what the Trump administration could really do, are they really going to try to pursue war with Iran? Well, then we also have to take into account what a war would look like, because we're not just talking about some proxy war on the other side of the world. We're talking about conflict in a very vital region of the world that would then come back and impact the US economy directly in a number of different ways. So is the US dumb enough to actually pursue that? Just how far will they go, and just how much is Israel in Trump's ear directing him forward? Well, we got into all of that and more with the special guest earlier, so let's take a listen to that conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is Syed Mohammed Morandi, a professor at the University of Tehran. Professor Morandi, thank you so much for taking the time to join me.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and also Happy Nowruz. This is the Iranian New Year. It begins on the first day of spring.
Well, thank you. That's exciting. I'm glad I get to talk to you today. And I know that there is a lot going on in the world that is not necessarily exciting, but I do want to get into it. I know that we are 2 months into Trump's second term in office, and already you have the US ramping up tensions with Iran. And when it comes to Trump, it seems like one day he claims that he wants to have talks with Iran, that he wants to pursue some kind of agreement. Then the next day he's threatening them and he's making it look like he's ready for an all-out war. How do you view Trump's rhetoric so far?
It's difficult to say. I don't think anyone really knows what goes on in his mind. I don't think he really knows what he's going to be doing the next day. And that's something that a lot of people talk about. So I don't think I can add anything more to that that would be useful. But I find it unlikely that the United States would move towards some sort of military confrontation with Iran, because the consequences for the global economy in the United States would be horrific. If there is conflict, the oil and gas installations in the Persian Gulf region will no longer be producing oil. The tankers will be at the bottom of the Persian Gulf. The oil market, the global oil market, the global gas market will be in crisis. And the price of oil and gas could increase threefold, fourfold. And that would bring down the global economy. It would create a global economic depression far worse than 1929, in my opinion. And that would destroy the US economy. And then as the global economy goes down, you will have people on the move everywhere. And many will be moving towards the United States. So if the Americans are worried about illegal aliens, as they call them, or immigrants or illegals or whatever they're called nowadays, now is a trickle compared to what they will witness as their economy collapses. It would be a global catastrophe for everyone. And I don't think that that is something that the US military fails to recognize. And I'm sure that they are reminding Trump of that, or at least many in the military. Of course, Netanyahu, many of these, many Zionists are pushing for war because they're willing to sacrifice everyone for themselves. They are, after all, a supremacist group. But I think that there, at the moment, there are enough sane people in the Pentagon, sinister but sane, that know that this is not the road to take. But nothing is impossible. And the Iranians are prepared for war. They've been preparing for war, potential war with the United States ever since the United States invaded Afghanistan and Iraq. And ever since the first term when Trump came to power, I think that only those preparations were only increased.
Yeah, sinister but sane. You know, you look at the US military, and I would think that they have got to be sizing themselves up next to these other militaries. And they need to be keeping in mind when it comes to countries like Russia, China, Iran, they're all looking at the US wondering, what is the US going to do, right? When are they going to target us? Because in some ways it feels like not an if, but a when. When is the US going to possibly get to that point? And when it comes to the warnings that we're seeing from Iran, I know it was reported over the weekend that Iran's Revolutionary Guards unveiled new missile systems on 3 strategic islands in the Gulf, saying they can target nearby enemy bases, vessels, and assets. This also comes as you have Iran's supreme leader saying that US threats against Iran will get them nowhere, and warning that if they do anything malign to the Iranian nation, they will get a hard slap. How do you view the way that Iran is responding right now? It's trying to put the warnings out there, right? It's trying to make it clear to the US, look, we don't want war, but you shouldn't want it either. But how do you view the steps that they've taken so far?
Well, in order to make sure that the United States doesn't do anything foolish, the Iranians are giving those warnings. Remember, the United States has bases in these tiny Arab family dictatorships in the Persian Gulf. These family dictatorships wouldn't last more than a few hours, or at most a few days, if there was real war. Qatar has a population of 350,000. The Emirates has a passport-holding population of a bit over 1 million. Most people in these places are indentured servants or slaves, and they won't be able to control them once fighting starts. And they cannot fight, but they have U.S. bases. They will be complicit if the Americans attack Iran. The same is true with Bahrain and elsewhere. And there won't be any ships to take oil and gas. So you would see a collapse of all these regimes. It's not just that there won't be oil, the whole system will fall apart. And in Iraq, you will see, I'm sure you'll see chaos, and Iraqis will be dealing with the United States inside Iraq, and you could see the same in the Caucasus. If there's war, then it's war. The Iranians, it will be an existential battle, and the Iranians will make sure that the Americans do not win. And I think that within not months or years, not weeks, I think within hours, the Americans will see the consequences of war. They will see the stock market collapse, and not just some 20%, 15% fall. I think this is going to be something that generations to come will remember. So in the Iranian bases, they are across the country. They're not just in one or two places. They have underground bases across the country. and in the Persian Gulf as well. Drone and missile bases, well protected, deep down. It's just not something. And the Americans, if they want to really fight with Iran, they will have to bring like 1 million people here. They'll have to bring 1.5 million soldiers. They will have to mobilize in a way which they've never done before in contemporary history. Do they have that money? And the consequences will still be the destruction of these family dictatorships that have these bases. So do the Americans have the money to mobilize like this? Because this is Iranian turf. This is, the Americans will have to come from across the world to fight. I mean, they cannot defeat Yemen, which is, you can't compare Yemen to Iran, and you cannot compare the Red Sea to the Persian Gulf. So I don't, again, I think the warnings that the Iranians have made, the Iranians have created a balance of terror. Let's put it this way. Sort of like the Soviet Union and the United States during the Cold War. The oil and gas facilities and the vital reserves that exist in the Persian Gulf region and the broader region, they're just too important. And so I don't think any sane U.S. leader would seriously contemplate war. But again, it's not impossible. That's why Iran has prepared itself. So Iran is speaking this way just to warn Americans not to believe the propaganda, we're number one, we can just go in and flatten everyone. That's not going to happen.
Yeah, and I think that the U.S. needs to be aware of it, the American people certainly, right? Because they're the people who, they care so much about their gas prices and their, stock portfolios and on and on. But as you're noting there is a lot more at stake here than just a direct war, any kind of proxy war. If you're talking about an economic war, I mean, I was reading up on the Strait of Hormuz earlier and being reminded that this is one of the world's most strategically important choke points, as it sees the passage of 1/3 of the world's liquefied natural gas and nearly 1/4 of total oil consumption. And so as you're laying it out there, if the US is looking at this from a logical perspective, they're not going to pursue a war with Iran. But when you have Netanyahu and you have, I guess, the influence that he seems to have over Trump, or maybe it's Trump, I don't know what all is part of the inner workings of that relationship, but what are your concerns for how far Israel could try to drag the Trump administration into a direct war, even if the US is the one being directly hurt by it, in addition to obviously also Israel?
That is the key question, whether the Zionists and the Zionist lobby in the United States, whether they have the power to convince the United States to bring about the destruction of the US economy, the destruction of the global economy, in order to do something that's in the interest of this ethno-supremacist regime. At the moment, I know that Zionists have enormous power, and I know that their priority is Israel. They are Israel firsters, as they say. They're not American firsters, but they have huge power in the United States. But at the moment, I don't believe that they have enough power to push the United States towards this war of self-destruction. And it is self-destruction. If the price of gasoline, for example, in the United States goes up to $15 to $20 a barrel, it won't just be something, it just won't make it life unlivable for ordinary Americans. It will bring down the economy. It will shut down all businesses. People will lose their jobs. They will, not only will gasoline be too costly, but the whole economy will collapse. And then when the economy collapses everywhere, and that includes our part of the world too, then people will move. If they're worried about, as I said, if they're worried about these huge numbers of people coming to the United States, well, it will increase tenfold, maybe 20-fold. If that's what, I mean, it's difficult for me to imagine that scenario. It is so horrifying. It is so, it's so dystopian.
Bro,
but it is a possibility. I think that the big problem is, the American people, because Americans are ignorant about foreign policy. They're ignorant about the broader world. They're not less intelligent than other people. I know they know a lot about baseball players and football players and basketball teams, and they know their statistics and but they don't know about, and they don't recognize that the world has changed, and they're still being fed propaganda by the media. And Americans have a tendency to like war. When even Trump's opponents during Russiagate, during the height of Russiagate, when he decided to bomb Syria, suddenly the mainstream media were all rooting for him, even though they were calling him illegitimate and a Russian stooge. Just hours before, suddenly they were saying he's finally become the U.S. president. And then, of course, after a while, when the bombing stopped, they went back to Russiagate. So that is a problem, that Americans can be convinced that they're number one, and they can beat these Arabs, even though Iranians are not Arabs, and they can slaughter these camel jockeys, even though we don't ride around in camels, and San so and the N-word. They can come to believe that nonsense, but by the time they find out that that's not what's going to happen, or that's just not possible, it'll be too late. So, we have to see it. I think a lot depends on those sane but sinister people that I was speaking about in the Pentagon, I think.
Yeah, and I think that that's a great point to keep in mind when it comes to the, of course, Americans' outlook, how the government plays a role in that. And I'm also curious too, because I know that the topic of nuclear weapons has come up quite a bit in recent days. You had U.S. National Security Advisor Mike Waltz saying in an interview on Sunday that the Trump administration is demanding the, quote, full dismantlement of Iran's nuclear program, and that this isn't some kind of tit for tat that we had under the Obama administration and Biden. This is the full program. Give it up or there will be consequences. Okay, what do you make of a statement like that, and the fact that the Trump administration is suddenly trying to make this a big issue, it seems?
Well, you see, that's the problem. First of all, the United States, Iran will not accept having its sovereignty taken away. That's just not going to happen. And in addition to that, the U.S. National Security Advisor says this right after Witkoff, just a couple of days ago, was saying that, if there's a verification process, even though Witkoff said a lot of nonsense too, but Witkoff was not talking about the dismantlement of the nuclear program. So it just shows that the United States is not trustworthy. They say different things on different days to different people. One day they'll say this, and then tomorrow morning they'll say something completely different. How can Iran negotiate with the United States under such circumstances? I mean, let's look at the ceasefire in Gaza. Witkoff was behind the ceasefire. Then Witkoff allowed Netanyahu to violate the first phase. He prevented food from getting in, medicine from getting in. He didn't allow the tents to get in, or these small pre-built homes to get in, or heavy equipment to take away the rubble. All of those were violations of the deal. It was fine with Witkoff. And then when they were supposed to move to the second phase, and Netanyahu refrained from doing so, Witkoff blamed Hamas. And he demanded Hamas to change, to accept new terms. This was a deal that Witkoff was behind. So if Witkoff is not going to abide by his own deal, then how could Iran negotiate with anyone in Washington? When the United States, regardless of its arrogance, the arrogance of the regime in Washington, regardless of its unrealistic expectations, when it does not abide by a deal that it itself, a ceasefire deal that it itself was behind, when it speaks to the Iranians and one day it says one thing and the next day it says something else, then why should Iran even think about negotiating with the United States? That is the key question. So if Trump ever wants to have the possibility of dealing with Iran, he's going to have to change. That's, the United States will have to change. For Iran, it doesn't matter who's in the White House. What matters is that if there's going to be negotiations, the Americans have to respect. They have to show respect. Two, the Americans have to have a track record that's acceptable. What we're seeing in Gaza shows that Witkoff is not someone you can negotiate with under these circumstances. One side violates, he blames the other side. He expects the other side to change, to accept new terms that he imposed. The terms were those terms were something that Witkoff negotiated. Now he's saying no, you have to accept something else. This is not something that the Iranians can work with.
Yeah, it's bizarre to me to watch the way that the Trump administration has handled the ceasefire in Gaza. And then at the same time, as you're noting there, they're one day claiming that they want to talk with Iran. They're trying to pursue dialogue with Russia, they claim. And it's like, how do you expect any of these other countries to trust you when you're flip-flopping back and forth from day to day on these incredibly important issues? Now, when it comes to the conversation about nuclear weapons, the last thing I wanted to ask on that was I watched the way that the US is framing this, and they act as though Iran's sole goal is to create a nuclear weapon and then to use it against the United States or maybe Israel. But when you look at the position that Iran is in, they're also looking at the US and Israel, and they're aware that both the US and Israel have nuclear weapons, whether they want to admit it or not. So what kind of a position does that put Iran in, where, as you've noted, look, they do not want an existential war, but they also are aware that if there is some kind of war with the United States, it would be existential for them.
The United States knows that if Iran wanted to develop a nuclear weapon, it could have done it many years ago. Iran is one of the most advanced countries in the world when it comes to nuclear energy. And so this sort of talk is just nonsense. It is, again, the Zionist lobby and the Israeli regime that are pushing this sort of narrative. They've been saying for 30 years now that Iran is on the verge of developing a nuclear weapon. It's always a weeks away or months away or a couple of years away. We've been hearing that for 3 decades. Iran has no intention of developing a nuclear weapon. And Iran has said so. Unless, as the Iranians have said, unless there's some sort of existential threat to the country, which would mean the threat of using nuclear weapons against Iran, then Iran's nuclear posture would change. Iran would then probably have to leave the NPT. But that's not something that Iran wants. The United States and the Israeli regime, on the other hand, have threatened to use nuclear weapons. The United States has done it repeatedly, and the Israelis have just recently, senior Israeli officials during this Holocaust in Gaza, I think one of the government ministers said we should use a nuclear weapon on Gaza. So this is, it's an insane regime, fanatical ethno-supremacist regime which has nuclear weapons. That is where the threat is. So this argument doesn't make sense. Iran is not going to give up its peaceful nuclear program. It's just, that's out of the question. But it's the U.S. behavior in our region that has, and the Israeli regime that has created this catastrophe. Iran did not invade Libya. Iran did not, or destroy Libya. Iran did not send ISIS and Al Qaeda to destroy Syria. Iran did not invade Iraq. Iran did not invade Afghanistan. Iran did not fund the genocide in Gaza. It was Hezbollah was created as a result of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. They took the capital, Beirut, and it was then that Hezbollah was born as a national resistance organization to expel the Israeli regime from Lebanon, which they did. So to create this upside-down narrative where the Americans, who, as far as I recall, they are in North America, that they are the victims in our neighborhood, that's something that people across this region just don't accept. It. You don't have to be Iranian to think that way. I think across this region, people are outraged by what the United States is doing in Gaza, what the United States is doing in the West Bank, what the United States has done to the region. And the Americans can pretend that it's Iran's fault, but no one's buying it.
Yeah, and all of the ways in which Trump claimed that he was going to campaign on peace, right? These were Biden's wars. He then comes in, and within 2 months, now all of that blood is on his hands as he is continuing a number of conflicts all around the world. And it is going to be interesting to see where things go from here. Certainly a lot at stake here all around. And I really appreciate you taking
we've seen Yemen launch its Palestine 2 ballistic missile into Israel, claiming it has hit the Nevada air base. Also, it has launched missiles and drones at the USS Harry Truman after 72 hours of bombing by the Trump administration into Yemen. And now the big news, too, is that Trump has greenlit the Israeli re-invasion of Gaza after the threadbare ceasefire expired. Israel killed more than 400 Palestinians in a 24-hour period. This is an absolute disaster. In my assessment, this is also a disaster for the Trump administration. But what is your assessment? In some ways, this is just an incredible about-face in such an early phase of this new peacemaker administration, as it claimed.
Yeah, it's hypocritical in so many ways. I mean, of course, we know that U.S. politicians are very often hypocritical. But in the case of Trump, we saw that he claimed that he would be the peace candidate. He claimed in his inauguration speech that he was going to pursue peace, although he also claimed in his inauguration speech that he would expand the territory of the U.S., and he threatened to colonize the Panama Canal and other parts of the world, Greenland. So he's always had this very contradictory rhetoric. But here we are, and just 2 months in, Trump has massively escalated the U.S. war on Yemen, the poorest country in West Asia. I just saw a tweet from CENTCOM, the U.S. military central command, and they boasted that they're bombing Yemen 24/7. That's the language they used, 24/7. Trump also restarted this genocidal war in Gaza. Israel would not have taken this decision were it not given approval from the U.S. And it was reported by Trump administration officials that Trump personally gave the green light to Israel, to Netanyahu, to start this war and to tear up the ceasefire that he helped to broker. Of course, right before he came into office, Trump told Netanyahu, who was a close personal friend, he said, you have to pause this war because you need to give me a reputational boost. As I come in as president, I want to portray myself as the peace president. And then now here we are 2 months later, and Trump said, go ahead, continue the genocide. By the way, you know, it's not just my opinion. It's not just your opinion. This has been stated very clearly by multiple United Nations committees that this is a genocide. Multiple experts in international humanitarian law. There have, for instance, the United Nations, just a week ago, they published another report by one of these special committees. They often create these special committees that feature professors of international law and legal experts, and they come together and they study certain issues. And they've done this on Gaza, and they have repeatedly said this is a genocide. According to the legal international definition, the Genocide Convention, this meets the definition. And this is why South Africa introduced a lawsuit against Israel in the International Court of Justice, accusing Israel of genocide. And the justices, the judges at the ICJ, which is the top UN legal authority, ruled that Israel can be investigated in the accusations of genocide, that there is a legitimate case to be made. And of course, many other countries in the global south have joined South Africa in this case, including many countries in Latin America, Nicaragua, Bolivia, Mexico have joined this case, several other countries in the global south. And of course, there's also this case in the International Criminal Court, although, we see why people in Africa have long referred to the ICC as the International Caucasian Court, or I prefer International Colonial Court, because Netanyahu has an outstanding arrest warrant, and yet Netanyahu constantly is traveling to the U.S. He was just in the White House in Washington a few weeks ago, meeting with Trump. No consequences. Israel flew over French airspace, and the French government that claims to be a supporter of freedom and democracy, and they even claim to support the ICC, they did nothing. They allowed this wanted war criminal who's wanted by the ICC to go to the US. So what this really shows is that the ICC arrest warrant was marketing. I mean, I was always I hate to sound cynical, but I was always very skeptical about it. I knew they would not act on it, and now we see that. And furthermore, by the way, right after Trump came back into office, he put sanctions on the ICC. This didn't get a lot of attention because Trump literally signed hundreds of executive orders, and it's easy to get distracted by all of the crazy things that are happening. But, the Biden administration was threatening to put sanctions on the ICC. Trump put sanctions on the ICC, and here we are. And then, just a few days ago, the ICC arrested the former president of the Philippines, Duterte. And of course, you know, this is obviously because Duterte was very friendly to China. The current leader of the Philippines is the son of the longtime dictator whose crimes were way worse than Duterte's crimes and never faced any consequences. Ferdinand Marcos Sr., he stole billions of dollars from the people of the Philippines. And now his son with the same name, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., Bongbong Marcos, is the president. No consequences. So what we see is that the ICC has made it clear there's a set of rules for certain countries, you know, in the global south, of certain skin complexion. If they're dark skinned, if they're white in the global north, no consequences. Netanyahu, who's an American, he had U.S. citizenship 2 times, spent most of his formative years growing up in the U.S., no consequences. So getting back to Trump, in terms of what's going on in Gaza and also Yemen. So in the case of Gaza, even the ceasefire was marketing. It was a cynical branding exercise, because different estimates showed, one of the estimates I saw is that Israel violated the ceasefire at least 900 times in the 2 months between January, when it was started, and now when it officially ended the ceasefire, by killing 400 Palestinians in one day, including well over 100 Palestinian children in one day. And so the ceasefire was only a one-sided ceasefire, which is often the case with Israel. When it signs a so-called ceasefire, they expect that the Palestinian side won't violate the ceasefire, but Israel can violate it hundreds of times with no consequences. In terms of Yemen, now the narrative that the Trump administration is using is that they have to attack Yemen because Yemen has been targeting ships in the Red Sea. However, Yemen has made it very clear. When we talk about Yemen, we're talking about the de facto government in the north of Yemen, where the majority of the Yemeni population lives, about 60% of the population. Not the puppet regime in the south, which is basically controlled by the US, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. And is totally illegitimate and has an unelected government in the south of Yemen. In the north, where the majority of the population lives, there is a revolutionary nationalist government, which has a liberation theology, Islamist orientation, like Hezbollah, which is referred to as the so-called Houthis, but that's actually a derogatory term. That's not what they're called. They're called Ansar Allah, like Hezbollah in Lebanon. They're very similar. And the U.S. has this propaganda narrative claiming that supposedly Ansar Allah are Iranian proxies, which is completely BS. It's bogus. It's not true. Now, they're allies politically with Iran, like Hezbollah in Lebanon are allies with Iran, but they're not proxies. Ansar Allah, like Hezbollah, has its origins as an indigenous resistance movement in Yemen, just like Hezbollah emerged in Lebanon as a response to Israel's illegal military occupation of southern Lebanon in the 1980s. And Hezbollah was this militant organization that brought together a liberation theology view of Shia Islam, along with third world nationalism, global South nationalism. And they've even been influenced by some other revolutionary, even socialist movements. For instance, they were very very supportive of Hugo Chavez and the Bolivarian Revolution in Venezuela. They spoke very highly of the Vietnamese Revolution and Ho Chi Minh. And if you read some of the late leader of Hezbollah, Nasrallah, he talked about how they modeled their guerrilla warfare activities after the National Liberation Front of Vietnam. That was one of their big influences. So I think the way I think of these groups is that there are these, what used to be called third world nationalism or global South nationalist movements, right? And in Yemen, it's very similar. In fact, the so-called Houthis, Ansar Allah, their ideological leadership, they have praised Hugo Chavez previously. And famously, they were interviewed by a journalist for PBS. They published a very interesting documentary about them. And they said, there's this narrative that the U.S. is spreading, trying to claim that we're Iranian proxies. This is part of their sectarian propaganda. We support Iran, but we're not their proxies. And they said, we are strongly supportive of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. Why do they insist on calling us Iranian proxies? Because they're trying to create this sectarian narrative to justify this war against Yemen. And the war in Yemen did not just start now under Trump, of course. This goes back to really to Obama and then Trump's first term. And starting in 2014, going into 2015, they started a war on Yemen, and Saudi Arabia, with U.S. support, spent billions and billions and billions of dollars brutally bombing Yemen, the poorest country in West Asia, destroying civilian areas, devastating the country, killing hundreds of thousands of people, using hunger as a weapon, intentionally targeting food production sites to try to starve the Yemenis into submission. And they failed. And now what we saw is that, so the Ansar Allah has created a revolutionary government in what's referred to as the September 21st revolution, which is going back to 2014 when they had this revolution that overthrew an unelected, a fake elected leader who ran an election overseen by the U.S. in which there was no other candidate in Yemen. So, you know, a U.S.-backed dictator, and the Yemeni people overthrew the illegitimate U.S. Saudi-backed regime. And Saudi Arabia in particular has a lot of influence in Yemen as kind of the proxy acting on behalf of the U.S. to exert control over Yemen. And so the Yemenis rose up and created this revolutionary government, influenced, yes, by the Iranian Revolution, but they're not proxies, they're allies. There's a big difference, right? And so the U.S. and Saudi Arabia and the UAE failed in this war after years of trying to destroy Yemen. And what happened when the Israeli regime started this genocide in Gaza, the Yemenis said, we are going to have humanitarian intervention. This is the responsibility to protect doctrine in order to stop the ongoing genocide because other countries are refusing to act. And the Yemenis said that any ships that are going to Israel, or eventually they also said that any ships from countries that are aiding Israel's genocide, we are going to intercept them and prevent them from materially supporting a genocide. They've allowed ships from other countries that are not participating in this genocide, like China, like Russia. So this idea from the U.S. that they're just attacking countries' ships in the Red Sea without any idea that it's just all just reckless, it's nonsense. It is humanitarian intervention. And this is really funny. It's actually very clever because the U.S. government has used this narrative and NATO has used this narrative for decades, claiming that they have to intervene in foreign countries because it's humanitarian intervention to stop genocide. This was, you know, in the Biden administration, the head of USAID, and then in the Obama administration, a top State Department official was Samantha Power, who was also at the United Nations. Samantha Power, she made her entire career as the intellectual advocate for humanitarian intervention and the responsibility to protect doctrine. And here the Yemenis, for the first time, are actually trying to use a real humanitarian intervention, a real act of responsibility to protect, to stop an ongoing genocide, not this cynical excuse they use to try to overthrow a foreign government like NATO did in Libya in 2011. They said it was responsibility to protect based on lies. They overthrew the Libyan government, killed Libya's leader, Muammar Gaddafi. The British Parliament later published a report admitting that it was based on lies. Well, here we are. The Yemenis are taking brave actions, trying to stop this genocide, and the U.S. response is to bomb them 24/7. One other quick note on this. Now, the Yemenis, when Israel signed this so-called ceasefire brokered by the U.S., Yemen paused its operations in the Red Sea. And they said, okay, the genocide has stopped. Our operations in the Red Sea will stop. Because again, they're not just recklessly attacking countries for no reason. It was part of an attempt to stop the genocide. When Israel announced that it was reinitiating the genocidal siege on Gaza to prevent all food and medicine and aid from going into Gaza, then Yemen reinitiated these operations to try to end the siege on Gaza, the genocidal siege, which violates international law. So it's actually Yemen that has been acting in a responsible way in support of human rights, whereas we see that the U.S. and Israel are doing the opposite of supporting human rights. They're committing genocide. And of course, it's no surprise that Trump is continuing this. It was, of course, Joe Biden and the Democrats who oversaw this when it started in 2023. But it doesn't surprise me at all because when Trump was running for president, he gave speeches for pro-Israel groups And he argued absurdly, insanely, Trump claimed that the Democrats were anti-Israel. And he famously, in his only debate with Joe Biden, when we saw that Biden's brain didn't work, in this debate, he's so crazy and so anti-Palestinian that Trump referred to Biden as a Palestinian, as an insult. Yep. And now he refers to Chuck Schumer, someone who, as a Palestinian. Chuck Schumer has never been pro-Palestinian in any way. He's only ever been pro-Israel. So, I mean, it's not surprising me at all, to me at all, that Trump is continuing this. But what it shows is that, the U.S. government is not a democracy. It is an empire, an imperialist authoritarian regime in which the only thing that the U.S. government can do is wage nonstop war around the world. It is not a force for peace. It is not a force for human rights, and it never has been.
I believe Chuck Schumer just wrote a whole soliloquy about anti-Semitism, targeting everybody who criticizes Israel. He's selling a book right now. So interesting that he's a Palestinian in Trump's eyes. It's absolutely ridiculous. But I wanted to ask you, Ben, about this particular component of Ansar Allah's humanitarian intervention, because it's exactly, I like how you put that, because they explicitly say this is an expression of them asserting the Geneva Convention. The Trump administration, Donald Trump himself, has said, this is a permanent war, that they're doing this to stop the attacks on shipping. Yet Ansar Allah intervened in the Red Sea before the genocide resumed in Gaza because of a blockade, explicitly because of the Gaza blockade. During the Biden administration, these missile strikes were actually quite troublesome. Israel now has the sirens back on every single day since the resumption of the genocide began. And U.S. aircraft carriers in the Red Sea and elsewhere, in the Mediterranean and elsewhere, are facing Yemeni hypersonic missiles seemingly every couple of days now. So what's your impression about this part of it? Because you mentioned the context of their resistance, but there's this element of the poorest people in the world using these incredibly advanced weapons to essentially assert the right to protect, which is supposedly the United States' number one doctrine, at least before Trump 2.0 decided to go isolationist ideologically. But for so long, this was the doctrine of the United States' empire. So what do you make of this military component of this resistance? It's quite astounding.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. It's amazing because it shows that the poorest country in the region is doing the most, after Iran, it's doing the most to actually support the Palestinians and to try to stop this genocide. So a few thoughts on this. First of all, let's keep in mind that Yemen is surrounded, it's the poorest country in West Asia. It's surrounded by some of the richest countries on earth that have not only done nothing to support the Palestinians, they're actually supporting Israel. So for instance, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, these are some of the world's largest oil and gas producers. They have some of the highest levels of GDP per capita on earth. They're just swimming in money. And instead of helping the Palestinians in any way, they're investing in Israel. And behind the scenes, we all know that they're supporting Israel. In fact, the UAE officially normalized relations with the Israeli regime. And Saudi Arabia was on the verge of normalizing relations with the Israeli regime. That's why the Palestinian resistance started this operation in the first place, is because they were saying that we're on the verge of being completely abandoned. The Saudis are going to normalize relations with the Israeli regime. This was following what Trump did. This, of course, has been the U.S. plan for decades. But during Trump's first term, he passed the Abraham Accords, in which the UAE and Bahrain normalized relations with the Israeli regime. And Saudi Arabia was always the prize. That's what the U.S. wanted. The Biden administration was also trying to pressure Saudi Arabia to normalize with Israel and was not successful. Although there were reports that, for instance, that the Biden administration was offering the Saudis nuclear technology, which is very funny because we hear all this propaganda demonizing Iran for having a civilian nuclear program for nuclear energy. And the U.S. and Israel says they want nuclear weapons. And in the past, they didn't want nuclear weapons. There was never any evidence of that. But now the ultimate irony is that it would be logical for them to pursue nuclear weapons, considering that the U.S. and Israel are obviously hell-bent on attacking Iran. And Trump himself just tweeted out on his whatever his website, Truth Social. He truth out, stupidest term. He truthed out a threat to Iran. So Trump is now threatening war on Iran, which he famously said that Obama was stupid for threatening Iran. Well, I guess according to Trump's logic, he's also stupid. Anyway, the point is that, you know, there's all this propaganda about Iran's nuclear program. The U.S. was offering Saudi Arabia nuclear technology, transfer of nuclear technology in return for normalizing relations with Israel. By the way, according to the Wall Street Journal, which reported on this, in the Biden administration, the U.S. had 3 demands for Saudi Arabia. And you can bet that the Trump administration is doing the same thing, and they probably have the same demands. Those 3 demands for Saudi Arabia normalizing with Israel is that, 1, that the U.S. would provide security support and nuclear technology to Saudi Arabia. 2, that Saudi Arabia must continue to sell its oil in dollars and only dollars. And 3, that Saudi Arabia must limit its relations with China, break off all military relations with the Chinese military, between the Saudi and the Chinese militaries, and not allow China to build infrastructure in the region. According to the Wall Street Journal, those were the 3 conditions being negotiated. And then, of course, the Palestinian resistance started this response to Israel's genocidal blockade of Gaza, which has been going on for 15 years. And, you know, they have, according to international law, the Palestinians have the right to armed resistance against illegal Israeli occupation. And the Israeli blockade of Gaza, going back now almost 20 years, that is considered an act of occupation according to international law. So the Palestinians had a right to armed resistance that has been reasserted in numerous United Nations General Assembly resolutions. Now, in terms of how the Gulf regimes are helping Israel, I already talked about how behind the scenes they're trying to normalize, but they're also investing in Israeli settlements. This has been reported by mainstream Western media outlets, including the Wall Street Journal, which has a lot of sources in Saudi Arabia. And they reported that just right after Trump's first term ended in 2021, Trump's Middle East policy advisor, West Asia policy advisor, was Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, married to his daughter, Ivanka. And like Trump, Jared Kushner is a multimillionaire real estate developer. And so Kushner, right after Trump left office, Kushner created an investment company that invests very heavily in Israeli companies. So what happened? Right after the first Trump term ended, when Jared Kushner was working very closely with the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Qataris, right after he left office, the Saudi regime, the Emirati regime, and the Qatari regime, which all have sovereign wealth funds where they, you know, these are oil and gas exporters. They get paid in a lot of dollars. They have a lot of excess dollars. They don't want to convert all of those to their local currencies because it would overvalue their currency. And that is that would make their exports less competitive and such. And it has negative repercussions for the economy. So instead, they invest those dollars in buy up different assets. So what happened? The UAE, the Saudi regime, and Qatar, they invested billions of dollars from their sovereign wealth funds in this investment fund created by Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, based in Florida. And then what did Kushner's investment firm do with that money? It invested that money in Israeli companies that profit from Israeli settlements. In other terms, the Saudi regime, the Emirati regime, and the Qatari regime are profiting from Israeli colonization of Palestinian land. So not only have these regimes done nothing to help the Palestinians, they are directly complicit in the colonization of Palestinian land and the genocide against the Palestinian people. This is why the late and great Palestinian revolutionary leader, intellectual, Ghassan Kanafani, famously argued that it's not just the Israeli regime and Israeli colonialism that is the enemy of the Palestinian people, but also what he referred to as the reactionary Arab regimes, in particular the Gulf monarchies that have for decades collaborated with U.S. imperialism and helped the U.S. empire and the the Israeli regime, try to crush all of the resistance movements in West Asia. And over decades, those resistance movements have evolved in different ways, right? So, during the first Cold War, many of these resistance movements were led by communists. Like in the Palestinian case, there was the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP. They still exist, but they're not the largest Palestinian armed group today. And there were similar groups in other parts of the region. You also had revolutionary left-wing Arab nationalism, like Nasser in Egypt. You also had the rise of Baathism, which was a socialist Arab nationalist movement. And you had the more left-wing variety, which was in Syria, and the more right-wing variety that was in Iraq. But they were also committed to fighting against Israeli colonialism and supporting the struggle of the Arab peoples against Western colonialism. So after destroying all the communist movements, the US and Israel and Saudi Arabia destroyed all of the Arab nationalist movements. Ironically, there was a kind of proxy war backed by the US between Saudi Arabia and Egypt under Nasser in Yemen. So Yemen has been a big part of this for a long time. During the first Cold War, Yemen was divided between North and South, which basically it is again today, almost on the exact same boundaries. And South Yemen had a Marxist government that was very close to the Soviet Union. And the US and Saudi Arabia were trying to use the northern part of Yemen to wage a proxy war against the Arab nationalist movements, especially Nasser's Egypt. So what we saw is that the US and Israel and Saudi Arabia destroyed all of the Arab nationalist movements. The overthrow of the Syrian government was basically the end of Arab nationalism as a force that had state power. The Iraqi Ba'athist government was destroyed by the US in the invasion of 2003. Syria's Ba'athist government has been overthrown. Libya, Gaddafi was also a revolutionary Arab nationalist. His government was destroyed. So now that the US and Israel destroyed all of the communist movements and all of the Arab nationalist movements, now they're going after all of the Islamic-oriented nationalist resistance movements. And like I said, I think the best way to understand movements like Hezbollah in Lebanon or Ansar Allah in Yemen or the PMFs, the Hashid forces in Iraq, which is called the Islamic Resistance of Iraq. All of these movements are basically, you can think of them as a combination of kind of third world nationalist movements and liberation Shia Islam. And now these are the largest, most powerful resistance groups in the region. And the US and Israel and Saudi Arabia are committed once again to destroying all of the resistance, making sure that the region can be entirely dominated by US imperialism. And we see that most of the regimes in the region are a bunch of puppet regimes controlled by the US. Jordan being the greatest example. The Jordanian monarchy is a joke. I mean, people in Jordan joke that the king of Jordan speaks Arabic with an English accent because English is his first language. I mean, he's definition of a puppet. And when Iran responded to Israeli attacks against sovereign Iranian territory, including its consulate in Syria, in an act of self-defense that was in accordance with international law, the Jordanian regime intercepted or tried to intercept Iranian rockets and missiles to protect Israel. So this is the situation we're dealing with. Yemen and Iran at this point are the only states that are actually resisting Israel's genocide in the region. There are resistance movements in Lebanon, but they don't have state power. There are resistance movements in Iraq, of course, they don't have state power. And then, of course, there's the Palestinians who don't have a state because the US has prevented them from having a state. So now we see the continuation of this, where the US is trying to destroy the Yemeni resistance. So this is not a new project, of course. I already talked about how throughout the past several decades, the war on all of the anti-imperialist resistance movements in West Asia has continued and has changed in different ways as the movements have evolved. But Yemen is an example of how you don't need to be the richest country in the region. You can stand up and fight to try to stop genocide and resist colonialism. And that's why Ansar Allah, this movement in Yemen, has actually now become very popular all across the Arab majority world, all across West Asia. Many people have been praising them because they see them as standing up against imperialism, standing up against Israel's genocide. And again, it's so symbolic, the fact that they're the poorest country in the region. It shows, and the fact they don't have the most advanced military technology, they're making these very cheap drones. And yes, Iran is helping them. They don't dispute that, but they're not Iranian proxies. They're allies of Iran. And why do they have all of these weapons? Well, I already mentioned that some of them, they're making their own drones for very small amounts of money. And then Israel is spending millions of dollars through its Iron Dome system and other weapons that were provided by the U.S. So the U.S. military-industrial complex benefits and enriches itself, and Israel's spending all of this money. And by the way, you know who backs Israeli bonds? The U.S. government. So Israel goes further and further into debt to pay for all of these weapons from the U.S. by selling bonds, which are sold on Wall Street and backed by U.S. banks. And the U.S. government has said that if Israel defaults on its bonds, the U.S. government will make sure that the bondholders are made whole, that the U.S. will make sure that they're paid. So again, Israel is an extension of the U.S. empire. None of this, without U.S. support, Israel could not do any of this. This was even admitted by Israeli military officials in an article in Haaretz. They said if the U.S. withdrew support, this war, the genocidal war in Gaza, would end within 2 weeks. I would say within one day. And finally, the point I was going to say a second ago about where these weapons came from in Yemen. Yes, Iran has supported the Yemeni resistance, but a lot of these weapons came from the Yemeni military, because I already mentioned that the people of Yemen had a revolution, the September Revolution in 2014. And what happened? A lot of parts of the Yemeni military joined the revolution and joined Ansar Allah. And one of the reasons that there's this propaganda term of calling them the Houthis is because this is why the U.S. and the Saudi regime and the UAE, they're trying to, and Israel, they're trying to portray this mass movement in Yemen that has created a government as if it were one family or one tribe. The Houthis refers to a family and brothers who created originally the movement, but there are many millions of people involved in this movement. It's not just the Houthi family or tribe, but because this is the propaganda term used, they're saying that this family or this tribe of the Houthis are Iranian proxies. They've taken control of Yemen, ignoring the fact that in the northern part of Yemen, where the majority of the population lives, they've created a government that includes other political parties. They've created a political council that has representatives from different political factions in Yemen, including, by the way, there are Nasserists and Arab nationalists, and even there's a small socialist party in Yemen that are supportive of this coalition government. It's a revolutionary coalition government in Yemen. And they have these weapons because a lot of people in the Yemeni military joined them. So they don't need to get all of their weapons from Iran. This idea of them being Iranian proxies is, again, just propaganda.
And we want to start talking a little bit about Yemen, which of course has been much in the crosshairs of the United States, and that's only intensifying, and how to really view this question of Yemen's intervention in the overall conflict that is emanating from Gaza. And we are very, very honored to be joined here on the show once again by Craig Mokhiber, who's a longtime human rights lawyer. Craig, thanks so much for being with us.
Good to be here, Eugene. Hi, Rania. Nice to see you both.
Well, great to have you here with us. And, I guess one of the things that the issue I really wanted to raise with you here, we wanted to raise with you, is the issue of how we're seeing what's happening with Yemen. I mean, I think the way it's being portrayed, you see often, it's sort of like there's this rogue group called the Houthis that's just randomly firing missiles into Israel, and that this is some sort of totally out of bounds behavior. But I've noticed you've been making some good points in a range of different fora about how there's actually a close connection between Yemen's actions and the actual reality of human rights law based on what rulings have been made, vis-a-vis the genocide in Gaza at the ICJ and other places. I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that the whole world who's been paying attention has been horrified, not just by the genocide in Palestine over the past year and a half, but by the lack of a strong and coherent response from the international community to a genocide that has been live streamed, that has been unfolding in front of our very eyes for all of these months, month after month. And you would think with this whole architecture built up since the Second World War of international law and international institutions, precisely to stop these kinds of mass atrocities, that something meaningful would have been done to stop it. But unfortunately, what we've seen instead was, one group of states like the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, and some other Western states have actually joined directly in perpetrating the genocide. There's no other way to put that. They have been directly involved in the commission of these crimes on the ground alongside their ally, Israel. Then you've got another big group of Western states that have chose to be complicit in the genocide in other ways by supplying the genocide machine with fuel, with spare parts, with diplomatic cover, other things necessary to continue the genocide. Then you've got a large number of states from all regions who have chose to basically just remain silent and passive, which I have said is a breach of their international legal obligations, because all states have an affirmative obligation under international law to act to prevent and stop genocide and to enforce international humanitarian law. Most states have done nothing at all to these ends. Then you've got a fourth group of states that have opposed the Israeli regime in public statements. They've taken diplomatic action in their votes in the Security Council, in the UN General Assembly. They've joined cases in international tribunals like the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court. They've done that. But then there's another group, which is the smallest group, that have taken concrete steps to actively meet their obligations under international law. Remember, all states are obliged to do everything in their power to stop this genocide from continuing in Palestine. Who has actually done that? South Africa, when they brought Israel to trial in the International Court of Justice for genocide. I've said arguably Hezbollah, not a state, but it is a significant actor in that state, because it has engaged Israeli forces militarily, initially in territory illegally occupied by Israeli forces, the Shabaa farms in South Lebanon, to draw Israeli assets away from the genocide. And the third one that you mentioned very significantly, Yemen under Houthi control. Because, I think your viewers are more sophisticated than those watching corporate media, and they probably know that, the Houthis, Ansar Allah, they announced in response to Israel's genocide in Palestine that it would block shipping into the Red Sea that was headed to resupply the Israeli regime as long as it continues the siege and the genocide in Gaza. And it's been using this choke point at the head of the Red Sea called Bab al-Mandeb, which means the Gate of Tears, in this narrow strait between Yemen and Djibouti at the opening of the Red Sea. And they started this targeted partial blockade in November of 2023 when the genocide started by boarding an Israeli ship, and then they sustained the blockade until the announcement of the most recent so-called ceasefire. In my view, it was never a ceasefire, but the announcement of the ceasefire in Gaza. And at that moment, the Houthis lifted the blockade while the ceasefire was going on, demonstrating that they were doing this as a humanitarian intervention in order to meet what the International Court of Justice has said is the responsibility of all states, and what the General Assembly in its implementing resolution has confirmed is the responsibility of all states, to do everything in their power to stop the genocide and the siege that was being imposed on Gaza. Some ships avoided the blockade by sailing around Africa, but most of them couldn't. So the major shipping companies stopped sailing to the Red Sea, and the port of Eilat in Israel went bankrupt, which means that this blockade was working. It was denying the Israeli regime many of the goods that it needed to continue the siege and to continue the genocide in Palestine. By the way, the International Court of Justice has also said that all states have international obligations to stop any supplies or trade or economy flowing to the Israeli regime that it can use in the illegal occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip, including East Jerusalem. So again, these are acts that are consistent with requirements of international law that have been defined by the International Court of Justice and affirmed by the UN General Assembly. And demonstrated that the intent was what they said it was when they stopped it during the ceasefire. Now they have reinstituted the blockade because Israel has returned to expedited genocide and has reimposed the siege on the people of Gaza. And so the blockade is now in force again. In response, what's happening is the United States is bombing Yemen. So in response to Yemen's effort to help to stop genocide in Palestine, the United States is bombing Yemen, a country it's been bombing for over 2 decades now. It is violating international law and doing so. There's no question when the US is bombing Yemen, that's an act of aggression in international law. It's unlawful. They're slaughtering civilians in the process. This is a country which is already poor, suffering from famine and medical crisis, internal displacement. They're putting their own soldiers at risk and risking a broader regional war. They're spending billions of dollars on this bombing campaign, which could go to lifting some of the misery that the people of Yemen have been suffering from for decades now. And it's lying to its own people in the United States about what's happening, all for that one purpose, that the U.S. wants to continue to assist Israel's genocide in Palestine. Just finish by saying this is another direct act of U.S. complicity or participation in genocide, and it constitutes a crime under international law as well. We could talk a little bit more about the legal theory behind my argument that what Yemen is doing is a humanitarian intervention, but that's the big picture.
Well, I think it's really interesting that you're framing Yemen's actions as humanitarian intervention, because the U.S. claims to have the right to essentially terrorize all of these countries into submission. They call it fighting terrorism. That's what the Trump administration has called it. I think even in the language that the U.S. Secretary of Defense said about Yemen, and then that Trump ended up putting out on Truth Social about Yemen, it was something along the lines of, we have to defend ourselves from Yemeni aggression or Houthi aggression against their terrorism aimed at our drones. So now they've decided that it's terrorism to shoot down American drones in their neighborhood. But meanwhile, none of these countries are ever spoken about in the sense that they have a right to self-defense, or specifically in the case of Yemen, the right to intervene against a genocide, which is what you're supposed to do. So can you talk a bit more about, well, 2 things. One, the argument with relation to humanitarian intervention and framing what Yemen's doing in that context as an act of humanitarian intervention. And that also can include military acts, by the way. And then the second to that is, does Yemen not have a right to defend itself? Everyone's always rattling on about Israel's right to defend itself. Does Yemen not have the right to defend itself now that the U.S. is committing acts of aggression against Yemeni civilians?
Well, Yemen absolutely has a right to defend itself. And remember, it's been under bombardment by the U.S. and the UK and the Saudis and others going back for a very long time now. This is not something that is new, and they have a right to defend themselves from that, which, as I said, that's an act of aggression on the part of those forces that are bombing Yemen. No question about it. They do not fall within the narrow requirements of self-defense under the UN Charter. They haven't been authorized under the Charter. And they're only claiming that these actions are, of course, they use the language of terrorism, but they justify it as essential to protect commerce. Well, protecting commerce is not in the hierarchy of international law, something that is equivalent to stopping genocide. Both the International Court of Justice and the UN General Assembly have found that all countries are legally obliged to cease any support for the Israeli occupation regime, and, by the way, for the Israeli genocide. They're supposed to ban products. They're supposed to cut off military, diplomatic, economic, commercial, financial investment, trade with the Israeli occupation. They're supposed to respect the provisional orders of the International Court of Justice in the genocide case. They're supposed to respect their third state obligations under the Genocide Convention to stop it, and none of them are doing that. And to the contrary, what the U.S. action is doing, it is seeking to punish Yemen for trying to do what it can to stop the genocide that's happening in Palestine. And this norm in international law, the prohibition of genocide, also the right to self-determination, these in international law are called jus cogens norms, which just means they're the highest level peremptory norm from which there is no derogation. They apply to all states and all situations all the time, right? This is the highest level, stopping genocide, for example. And they are also, in legal terms, erga omnes, which means they impose obligations on all countries, right? And the GA resolution adopted under Uniting for Peace, which gives it an enhanced power, has said that all states are obliged to do these things. Now you have Yemen, which sees a grave breach of international law happening in its territorial waters and adjacent to its territorial waters. That is the supplying of a regime that is perpetrating genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, gross and systematic violations of human rights. It sees that these ships are heading up the Gulf in order to provide the supplies necessary for Israel's crimes. And it moved to stop those violations. So in that sense, Israel is respecting those international obligations, and the U.S. is actively violating. Yemen is respecting those obligations, and the U.S. is actively violating them. And Yemen is being bombed for trying to respect them. Now, people will say, well, yeah, but Yemen doesn't. First of all, Yemen is a divided country. It basically has two governments, maybe three. And the Houthis, Ansar Allah, they control the part of the country which is adjacent to the Gulf. They control the capital of Sanaa. They control the largest amount of the population, and they have the capacity to intervene. And so they've chosen to use that capacity. The second argument is, well, they didn't get Security Council authorization. And this one is important because you're supposed to have Security Council authorization to use force, which the US does not have, by the way. But first, the Security Council has been entirely disabled by the United States throughout the genocide. The U.S., as a co-perpetrator of the genocide, has blocked action by the UN Security Council. And as a result, it's entirely inoperative for the purposes of the genocide in Palestine. It's just one more example of how the U.S. is destroying the international legal system on behalf of this one oppressive foreign regime. Secondly, Yemen could argue that it's carrying out maritime law enforcement in its territorial waters, which doesn't require Security Council authorization. But even if it were said that the force that they're using doesn't fall within that law enforcement function, or someone challenged their status because of the divided government in the country, under the rules of the law of sea. By the way, the law of the sea treaty has been ratified by Yemen, but the U.S. refuses to ratify the treaty on the sea. It refuses to ratify many treaties because it acts as a rogue when it comes to international law. The Yemenis are claiming they're acting under the authority of international laws pronounced by the ICJ, reinforced by the General Assembly. And because the Security Council gets its mandate, and I'm getting a little legalistic, the Security Council gets its mandate from the UN Charter. That charter is a treaty that is a part of international law. And that means the Security Council is subject to international law. It's not above it. Since both the prohibition of genocide and the right to self-determination are Kogan's rules, that means that the Security Council cannot supersede those rules in any of its actions, even if it were to take action. And if action by the Security Council can't supersede these norms, then inaction or omissions by the Council can't be said to supersede them, unless what you're saying is, unless the Security Council acts, no state is required to meet its obligations under international law to do everything in its power to stop a genocide and to enforce international humanitarian law. Now, let's say that somebody disagrees with what I'm saying, my legal assessment. The remedy for that in international law is not to bomb the Yemenis. The remedy for that is either to bring a case before the International Court of Justice, a contentious case for a dispute, and have the court decide, or get the GA, the General Assembly, to request an advisory opinion on the question. But it has no right to wage war on Yemen in this regard. So you have a conflict here in which one side is saying there's a genocide going on. All countries are supposed to do what they can to stop it. We're doing what's in our power because we are adjacent to this vital sea crossing. And we're being bombed by a country that is one of the perpetrators of the genocide. Beyond mere complicity, it is actively participating in the genocide in Palestine, using its power in the Security Council to block action. That can't be the intent of the international legal system as set up after the Second World War.
Wow. Well, that's, I have to say, a fascinating analysis. And I think, I wish it was more widely known, and a very important context in terms of how people are talking about Yemen. So we really appreciate you, as always, coming to help us sort all this out. Craig Mokhiber, longtime human rights lawyer, thank you so much for some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you both. Thanks for what you do.
to dramatically increase production of critical minerals and rare earths. It's a big thing.
Trump has just declared war. He's just thrown down the gauntlet. This is a big fat middle finger to liberals and neocons, and I love every part of it. Oh, this time it's not the war they want, of course. This time it's not the kind of war where the liberal media or the neocons were hoping for. It's not the boots on the ground kind. It's not the missiles in the air kind. It's not the people dying kind, which is something they love. It's not their fantasy of a hot war with China. No, this is a different kind of war, one that actually benefits America this time. So we'll get into all of this breaking news here in a second. But first, Donald Trump is officially invoking wartime powers to undo decades of economic sabotage inflicted by the Clinton-Biden globalist machine. He's declaring war on the resource collapse in the United States, the total gutting of American industry, the outsourcing of our critical minerals, the handover of our energy security to the Chinese Communist Party. And oh, by the way, Trump is pissed. Trump has seen these numbers and he is pissed. How the hell did Clinton, Obama, and Biden screw over the United States to the degree that they did? Heck, I'm pissed. Every American should be pissed. This isn't some symbolic executive order. Trump is using the full weight of the presidency to launch a total economic offensive against China's grip on the global mineral supply chain and to expose the traders at home who allowed it all to happen. These traders outsourced America and got rich off of it. So just to bring you up to speed, Friday afternoon, Trump signed a sweeping new executive order that I think is one of the biggest of his presidency so far. It's titled, quote, "Immediate Measures to Increase American Mineral Production." But it's not just a memo, it's a wartime mobilization. Yes, we are at war, a direct invocation of the Defense Production Act, the same set of emergency powers used in World War II to transform the U.S. economy. Remember, during World War II, entire production facilities were transformed to start producing tanks and weapons and bullets to fight Japan and the Nazis. Now Trump is doing the same thing to take on China's mineral production, the very mineral production that we outsourced to them. So Trump declared the situation a national emergency, saying, quote, "The United States can no longer depend on foreign adversaries to fuel our economy, our energy grid, our military." This is how presidents talk when they're preparing for war. And make no mistake about it, this is a war, not against a foreign country with tanks and planes, but against a system, okay? The Obama, Clinton, Biden globalist system. This has hollowed out America from the inside out. They are traitors, and they turned the keys over to China. Here are some brutal numbers for you, okay? Over 80% of America's refining capacity for critical minerals like lithium, cobalt, and rare earth elements, the stuff we need for EVs, for satellites, for missile systems, is now controlled by China. That didn't happen by accident, by the way. That was liberal policy. This was intentional. That was the result of Democrats shutting down our mines, piling on regulations, cozying up to the Chinese Communist Party. Remember the millions that the Biden crime family made from China? Yeah.
President Biden has claimed since the 2020 election that his family has not received money from China. That was a lie in 2020, and he continues to lie to the American people now. The Bidens have received millions of dollars from China.
I remember that too. Bill Clinton started it all. Barack Obama doubled down, and Joe Biden put it in overdrive. And now Trump is saying, no more, this is war. Of course, the corrupt mainstream press couldn't stand it. Instead of reporting the biggest energy independence push in modern history, bringing America First energy policy back to the United States, no, the shitty New York Times literally fabricated a story about the Pentagon leaking secret war plans against China with Elon Musk and satellites. What? You can't make this up. Yes, saying that Trump is planning to go to war against China and Elon Musk was given the tip-off about the whole thing. Trump didn't waste a second. He went live from the Oval Office and he destroyed the New York Times.
But if you read what's out of the New York Times, it's such a dishonest newspaper. It's such garbage. It's, it used to be called all the news that's fit to print. Well, it's all the news that's not fit to print. But this was a made-up story by the New York Times. I call it the failing. It's a failing newspaper. It's failing. And they shouldn't do that. They really are the enemy of the people.
But the media doesn't want peace. They don't want supply chains. They don't even want solutions. They want conflict, the kind that they can sell. Now, you'll recall on Meet the Press with Chuck Todd, that little doofus, NBC actually ran a full tabletop simulation of the United States going to war with China in the next few years. They gleefully used maps and generals and scenarios, getting all ready for war, like preparing the American people.
Today, we have a unique and special episode. This is a war game that takes a look at how the United States might react if China were to invade Taiwan. And we wanted to know more about these war games. What do they look like? How do they unfold? What would it take to win, especially in this moment we're in and what's happening in Ukraine? Yeah. So to find out, we worked with the Gaming Lab at the Center for a New American Security, CNAS. This is a think tank that specializes in national security. CNAS convened 2 teams to fight it out here in our Washington studio. The blue team, a group of defense experts, and the red team, China experts.
Can you imagine? NBC is preparing us? Who asked for that? Liberals did. Liberals and neocons planned that. Ukraine. That's why the media, who's in cahoots with all of them, got together and put together this little tabletop exercise. Yeah, we're going to war with China. Basically priming the American public for another manufactured war, just like Iraq, just like Afghanistan, only this time with nukes and hypersonic missiles, and the United States wouldn't survive. So the New York Times, the neocons, the liberal warmongers, they all want a kinetic war, a hot war, one that enriches defense contractors and distracts from their failures. And then here comes Trump, kicking their war fantasies to the curb and saying, no, let's actually fight the war that matters, an economic war that puts America first. Let's stop the actual fighting. But let's really get into the weeds here with some of these numbers. This is pretty shocking. According to the BBC, over 70% of the world's lithium is processed in China. More than 90% of rare earth elements used in jet fighters, radar systems, electric vehicles, smartphones are all refined in China. And in 1995, the United States led the world in rare earth production. But by 2010, after Obama and Clinton and Biden have gotten their hands in it, we're nearly importing all of it from Beijing. Why? Because the liberals running Washington decided that mining was bad. Environmentalists said mining was bad.
How dare you?
Liberals said energy independence was bad.
How dare you?
Self-reliance was bad. We need a global borderless energy system. A great reset. What a bunch of morons. So they shut it all down. They let China dominate the future. Now Trump's response? Use the Defense Production Act to rip it all back. So President Trump's wartime order unleashes a number of things. Emergency mining permits, okay? Billions in federal funding for refining plants, fast-tracked environmental reviews, tax breaks for companies that relocate supply chains from China back to the United States. This is what real leadership looks like, not press conferences, but actual wartime mobilization right now. This is why neocons are panicking right now, why the left is melting down, because Trump's war is real. It threatens all of their profit centers. It threatens their fake climate crusade.
How dare you?
It threatens their alliance with China, because Trump is doing something no one else would do right now. He's treating our mineral dependency like a national security threat. He's using wartime emergency powers to bring those resources back, and he's not apologizing for it. So while the New York Times invents lies and the Pentagon war gamers drool over fake China invasions, Trump is actually fighting the real war, the war that matters. Not a war of destruction, but a war of restoration, restoring our resources, restoring our industry, restoring our power. And if you think the elites are scared now, just wait until the drilling starts. So that's the news update part of today's video. Now I want to tell you about today's sponsor.
Cool figure. Follow me.